Hey, welcome everyone. It's very nice to see all of you here. It's like standing in front of a living, breathing, fantastic bibliography. According to this card, my name is David. I want to begin with the apologies by dealing with some technical aspects. Presenters will be speaking for about 25 minutes. The Q&A will follow the presentations. About 5 minutes before you finish presenting, I will flash this handy sign to you, okay? To give you a sense of how time is running. Please silence your phones. The coffee machine over there is loud. Please don't use it while people are speaking. Don't use your laptop to connect to the web, to manipulate anything, as something will be destroyed. There'll be fire. I will have to run to Shai. It'll be horrible. Okay. Now more seriously, thank you again all for being here. Especially I want to thank Anat Yagil, who has coordinated everything logistical about this conference, is coordinating everything logistical about this conference, and about many, many other events. She's doing this simultaneously and without the help of her erstwhile assistant. So thank you very much, Anat. You've been unfailingly kind and efficient. Itzik, thank you, and thank you to the rest of the staff. Iris, Keren, Shai, all the names I'm not mentioning. Thank you for giving us a wonderful framework, a wonderful misgeret, a very nurturing place to do what we do. Nothing happens without you, and I'm very thankful for everything you do. Thank you to the fellows, both the people who belong to the research group and those who are visiting fellows or independent fellows. A special thanks to our most senior fellows in the groups, Moises, where are you, Moises? And Yosef, very conveniently sitting together. Both of you have presented me and I think the rest of us with a wonderful model of excellent scholarship and warm collegiality. To my partner in crime, Claude, this, as you know, he's a genuine mensch, a gentleman, a gentle man. He has spearheaded this entire year-long project.
Sorry, it was oxymoronic. Cannot be a gentleman and a student.
My oxymoronic friend has made me feel extremely fortunate to collaborate with him, to be his colleague and of course his friend. So thank you very much, Claude. Now about the subject of our meeting. In this conference, we will be discussing primarily certain contentious forms of discourse and the ways that the discourse constructs or has constructed various identities, and to shed light on the many phenomena of discursive construction. I think we will, several of you will dissect the internal dynamics of words and ideas. Several of you will consider the potential and sheer weight of intellectual persuasion and emotional appeal, emotional inducement. We will no doubt also pay attention to personality, to psychology, and surprise, surprise, we will also pay attention to intellectual genealogies. However, lest we forget our disciplinary bona fides, I think we will also have to consider various contexts in which our polemical and apologetic texts are embedded or were embedded. These contexts, I think we can picture as concentric circles of cultural, social, economic forces that both shaped and were shaped by our discursive subject matter. As importantly, I think these texts, as I mentioned before, shaped the self-concepts, both of the authors and perhaps of audiences as well. Now, I say all this as someone who has tried to write the history of ordinary people. So I have to confess that I'm generally very skeptical. I have been all this entire year, confession time. I've been very skeptical of the cultural significance of the neat and tidy castles in the sky that polemicists and apologists have built. In fact, my instinct is to understand these discourses, not by reference to great minds as such, from Paul to Philo to your favorite 17th century conversos, but rather by reference to the messy late medieval and early modern world that those agile, restless minds addressed, and to the busy, complex people, the readers and the listeners, whose minds the writers and sermonizers sought to shape. I think we're wise not to forget that for new Christians and new Jews, life was an endless mobility. It was tumult. It was near chaos well into the 1600s. The individuals who comprised our new Christian / new Jewish cohort were perhaps people who wanted to build castles in the sky. They wished to live in such castles, but they also, no doubt, felt the strong riptides of arbitrariness, of vulnerability. This was in a milieu that was becoming heavily capitalized, culturally fragmented, and ruthlessly globalized. For our subjects, the observation of Sancho Panza, notice, not Quixote, but Sancho Panza is, I think, must have rung very real, and I quote, "Esta que llaman por ahí fortuna es una mujer borracha y antojadiza, y sobre todo ciega, y así no ve lo que hace, y sabe a quién derriba." Thank you.
Is being streamed?
Yes. Dear Itzik Hen, Director of the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies, for enabling us to have here 1 year of Civitas Day. Dear Sina Rauschenbach, chair of this opening session and good friend. Dear David Greisword, fantastic partner of this enterprise. Dear fellows and lecturers, dear staff of the IIIS, in about a week, I will name every one of you. And dear public, dear friends, the idea to name this conference New Christian and New Jewish Discourses of Identity between Polemics and Apologetics entail several premises and standpoints. During 2 intense days, very intense, I say, you will hear lectures by scholars coming from different parts of the globe and given from diverse perspectives, religious, social, cultural, from economy, the history of ideas, etc. Most of the lecturers are historians, but you will also find here specialists from literary studies and philology, either Hispanists, Lusitanists, Italianists, or Jewish study scholars. That said, to study the issue of Iberian converso and ex-converso Western Sephardi New Jewish Discourses of Identity as related to polemics and apologetics, it implies a certain politicization of the New Christian and New Jewish variegated and interrelated phenomena after so many years, I think, of historiographic negligence by mostly focusing on outcomes rather than the way these identities were framed. Looking from this perspective, identities, I do believe, are never constructed out of the blue as mere nostalgia or need for group belonging. Speaking about polemics from polemos, war, and about apologetics from apologia, speaking in defense, entails the idea of awareness and human agency as fundamental factors of identity building. Although the difference between both concepts are more a matter of emphasis and perspective than of a clear-cut difference between discursive genres, George Bernard Shaw purportedly said that the difference between defense and attack is related to the place you are vis-a-vis the gun machine. Nonetheless, both concepts invite us to study identities as both proactive and reactive, evolving phenomena. Moreover, the emphasis put in this conference on discourses invite us to ponder the conversion Western Sephardi experiences with some openness, I believe, and empathy vis-a-vis linguistic turn methodological approaches, without dismissing at all the importance of real facts. Language structures identities, either as imposing discursive regimes or as a creative and performative utterances of the self, of the group, and regarding the interplay, what it is considered as the other. In other words, polemical and apologetic discourses promotes the simple but very fundamental idea that identities are more situational than fixed. At the same time, this not necessarily means, as the trend is going on still today, that identity should be hybrid or liquid, as famously claimed by Zygmunt Bauman. Rather, the often situationality to act and react to certain needs and configurations. In this sense, certain premises from the current politics of identity could be endorsed in our discussions here, provided we bear in mind that identities did not necessarily reveal fixed traits of the self, of the group, and of the others as inner authenticities and essential authenticities. Departing from the idea that identities are plural, very often, multidimensional, and changeable, because they are framed, negotiated, and struggled, the perception of both the new Christian and the new Jews will be no more the exclusive domain of any particular standpoint, being Iberocentric or Judeocentric, modernist or traditionalist, teleological or heuristic, while taking in consideration the weight of tradition, social stratification, and culture. I do believe that the rich and fascinating range of lectures of this conference will certainly invite us to think about both the conversos and the Western Sephardic Jews in polemical and apologetic ways, also as exercise of self-reflection regarding the ways we use and misuse today our and others' assumed identities. Thank you.
Okay, and with this, I open the first panel and introduce our respondent, Professor Ruth Fein, who will then introduce Professor Kaplan. Ruth Fein is the Solomon and Victoria Cohen Professor in Iberian and Latin American Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The fields of expertise are semiotics and literary theory, the Spanish Golden Age, and the literature of the Conversion. In these areas, she has published 3 monographs, a series of collected volumes, and more than 150 articles. In addition, Ruth Fein was the director of the Department of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies, the Institute of Western Cultures, and the European Forum at the Hebrew University. She is also the founder of the Asociación de Hispanistas de Israel, the current president of the Asociación Internacional de Hispanistas, the vice president of the Asociación de Cervantistas, a laureate of the Spanish Orden de Mérito Civil, and a correspondent member of the Royal Spanish Academy. Fortunately, Ruth Fein has been closely collaborating with our research group during the whole academic year. She has been lecturing in our weekly colloquium. She has organized a workshop where a number of our colleagues participated, and she has been friendly enough to agree and introduce and respond to Joseph Kaplan today. Dear Ruth Fein, welcome back. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
And looking forward to.
Thank you. My voice is low. Should I get up or no?
As you wish, as you wish.
Okay, so I will, because No. So good morning, and I would like in the first place to congratulate the directors of this impressive project and conference on New Christian and New Jewish Discourses of Identity, Claude Stuczynski and David Grayswood. Thanking them for having entrusted me the task of introducing our dear and admired Professor Joseph Kaplan. It is a real privilege for me to assume this role, although I anticipate that I will not be able to live up to the expectations, given that Yosef's scholarly work far exceeds what is his very extensive and valuable curriculum vitae indicates throughout its dozens pages. And in order to help me in this endeavor, and given that we are dealing with an Israeli historian of Argentine origin, also an enthusiast reader of its literature, I will resort to the paraphrase of an author of that country, Jorge Luis Borges, and his well-known story, Pierre Menard, autor del Quijote, author of Don Quixote. The visible work developed by Professor Kaplan, the historian of early modern age, is perhaps impossible to enumerate. Having carefully examined his private archive, as well as those of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and those of international historiography, this work consists of the following pieces. Yosef Kaplan is Bernard Cherrick Emeritus Professor of Jewish History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, university where he completed all his studies up to his doctorate in Jewish history. He's a member of the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, and from October 2013 until September 2018 was chair of its humanities division. His research, as you all know, includes early modern Western Sephardi diaspora, Dutch Jewry in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the early Enlightenment and the Jews. Professor Kaplan has devoted his research to identifying and understanding the religious, social, and cultural situation of the communities of new Jews in Northern Europe, reconstructing the complex network of strategies that help create a singular identity. In this field, he has developed important research projects, published books, and more than 150 articles in scientific journals and chapters in books, thus becoming the pioneer and most influential researcher of the Iberian diaspora in the early modern age. Undoubtedly, his works have marked the course of research in this field. Among the various books he has published, although well known to those present here, I would like to highlight the following. From Christianity to Judaism, the story of Isaac Borovio de Castro, Oxford, 1989, Judíos Nuevos en Amsterdam, Barcelona, 1996, French version, Paris, 1999, An Alternative Path to Modernity, the Sephardic Diaspora in Western Europe, 2000, Leiden. He has edited, among others, Fin de siècle, End of the Ages, Hebrew, Jerusalem 2005, the Dutch Intersection 2008, and his most important recent publication, the fifth volume of the Posen Anthology of Jewish Culture and Civilization, Yale 2023. Yosef Kaplan has been and is the successful director of so many master's theses, doctoral and postdoctoral research projects. A consistently sought-after speaker, he has lectured at dozens of prestigious universities around the world. He was visiting professor at Yale University, fellow at the Royal Institute of Advanced Study in Wassenaar, the Netherlands, associate director of research at the École des Études en Sciences Sociales, Paris, Goldsmith visiting professor at the University College London, at the Wolfson College, Oxford, associated director of research at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, visiting fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, and member of the School of Historical Studies, Princeton. In 2012, He was awarded an advanced grant from the European Research Council, ERC, for a project on religious and cultural changes in the Western Sephardi diaspora in the early modern period. In recognition of his outstanding research oeuvre, in 2013, Professor Kaplan was awarded the very prestigious Israel Prize for his work on the history of the Jewish people. So far, with multiple omissions, the visible work of Joseph Kaplan. I now move on to the other, the subway, the endlessly heroic, the odd one, also, alas, for the joy of all of us, the unfinished one. This work, perhaps the most significant of Professor Kaplan, is the expression of a research that has illuminated new directions of the knowledge and understanding of the history of Iberia in the early modern age, but also the historiography in general, always relating his findings to wider questions of the nature of modernity. Since Joseph Kaplan has enriched the historiographic art, not only the macro history, but also very especially of micro history, of which today we will listen to an outstanding example, hence enhancing paradigms of early modern historiography as a whole. The invisible work of Joseph Kaplan, that which is not inscribed in the official curricula, includes, in the first place, the constant incentive, the loving and lucid guidance of dozens of students in whom he has sown the love of Iberian history and that of the new Jews of Northern Europe. Disciples who are now prestigious researchers, university professors throughout the world, many of them present here. The invisible work of Joseph Kaplan also includes developing and representing in the most outstanding way the best of Israeli historiography, which has given such worthy fruits throughout its history. His research concentrates rigor, erudition, but especially innovation and critical sensitivity of the documents on a solid and updated theoretical basis. The dissemination and projection of historical research in Israel throughout the world is the fruit of his tireless work. Finally, the invisible work of Joseph Kaplan is the one that bears the imprint of what I consider to be the authentic spirit of the researcher. The critical look is also the one that all of us who know, admire, and recognize in his daily work and human interaction. His immeasurable knowledge, his insatiable intellectual curiosity, and the constant generosity of sharing it, illuminating everything and everyone around him. For all this, we are grateful to him. I leave now the floor to Professor Kaplan, who will enlighten us today, which will be a fascinating lecture.
Thank you very much for so many lives. Thank you, Ruthie.
my very good friend, for all the lies that you said here about me. I know that it comes from deep friendship. And I still remember 3 of the most erotic years of my life with you in a wonderful group of scholars at the Institute for at Scholium. Our group dealt with Eros. And it was really erotic. And I would like to thank in this opportunity Professor Itzik Chen, friend, for this wonderful year here at the Institute. I keep very special memories from because I spent at the Institute the past several times. But in this occasion was very special to me. Thank you. I thank the wonderful staff of the Institute. And of course, this group, which with Claude and David and all the other friends here, it was really lovely and very enriching. And thank you for your friendship and for your collegiality. Now, 7 years ago, during a family visit to Southern Holland, Leontine and I happened to see an unusual theatrical performance. I believe the play was called Picnic, and the company was Vis-a-Vis. The actors spoke very little, but they displayed praiseworthy acting ability and acrobatic skill. Their movements and expressions made it known that the play dealt with a murder that the police were going out of its way to solve. It was performed outdoors in the open air. And before it began, the audience had to choose one of the 2 entrances that led to it. Later, we realized that the stage was divided in 2, and each of the entrances to the play enabled the audience to view the action on just half of the stage. However, the actors performed on both halves of the stage and went from one side to the other in a natural way. We could hear the responses of the audience that had entered on the other side, bursts of laughter or loud expressions of surprise, though we couldn't know the reasons for them. After the first act, we switched with the people sitting on the other side. We left the area from which we had seen the play and entered the other area. The actors then performed the play again, and this time the audience could see what was happening on the half of the stage that had been hidden from them until then. As a historian of the new Christians and their transitions from Judaism to Christianity and from Christianity to Judaism, I'm inclined to compare the experience of the spectators at that play to that of researchers into the history of the new Christian and their immigration to countries where they could live openly as Jews. The historian's experience is heightened in light of the fact that new Christians who returned to Judaism often went back and visited Spain and Portugal despite the danger this entailed, changing their apparent identity several times during their lives. In other words, on many occasions in my research, I experienced something like what the audience underwent at the play Picnic, though the lives of the new Jews were far from being a picnic. When I studied the life of Baltasar Alvarez de Orobio and his studies in Alcalá de Henares, I couldn't imagine that this man would later live as a Jew in Amsterdam and take part in theological disputes with Catholics and Protestants about the tenets of faith. But this fervent polemicist, who displayed extraordinary devotion to the Jewish religion, was in no hurry to leave Spain and Catholicism when he was freed from the Inquisition prison, nor did he immigrate to a country where he could live an open Jewish life. Rather, he chose to move to France, where he taught at the University of Toulouse for several years, continuing to live entirely as a Catholic. Similarly, Fernando Cardoso spent a good number of years in Madrid and frequented a circle of prominent authors and poets. He enjoyed the patronage of the Conde Duque de Olivares, the dominant figure in the court of King Philip IV, and did not rush to depart from Spain and return to Judaism when it became possible for him. As a physician, he treated the famous playwright Lope de Vega when he collapsed in a church, and after Vega's death, he wrote moving words in his memory, although he could not have failed to be aware of Lope's deep hatred of the Jews. Nothing in his behavior at that time hinted at the Jewish pride Cardoso was later to display in his apologetic work Las Excelencias de los Hebreos, which he wrote in Verona entirely as a Jew. But unlike Isaac Cardoso and Orobio de Castro, whose life stories on both sides of the stage are familiar to historians, the case I wish to speak about today is far from being clear or coherent. Cristobal Mendez, alias Abraham Franco Silveira, left behind no writings, and the vicissitude of his life hardly justify an encyclopedia entry. He was a mediocre man in every sense of the word. However, more than Orobio de Castro and Isaac Cardoso, he cavorted on both sides of the stage, and his journeys from Christianity to Judaism and from Judaism back to Christianity demonstrate acrobatic ability rather similar to that of the actors in Picnic, though, again, we must point out that his life was as far as possible from being a picnic. David Graysworth referred to this man in his splendid book, Souls in Dispute, and I wrote about him an article a few years ago, and during my stay here, I managed to finish a first version of a micro history dealing with Cristobal Mendez. Former conversos had various reasons for returning to the lands of the Inquisition. Some wished to see their relatives, sometimes even with the intention of encouraging them to become Jews. Others came to strengthen ties with business partners or to collect debts or even to collect their part of an inheritance. The Sephardi communities condemned those who visited the lands of idolatry with great determination. Traveling to these countries, as well as staying in France or the southern Netherlands, made these visitors into Marranos by choice, and the leadership of the communities could not countenance such a phenomenon. The Sephardi community of Amsterdam was the first to oppose travel to the terras de idolatria, lands of idolatry. An ordinance enacted in 1644 stated that those who travel to forbidden country would immediately, upon their return to Amsterdam, be required to ask forgiveness from the pulpit of the synagogue in public, and for 4 years they could not be appointed to any post at all in the community, they could not be called to the Torah, and they could receive no honors during services. The Sephardi communities of Livorno in 1655, Hamburg in 1657, and London in 1677 followed the example of Amsterdam and passed ordinances in a similar spirit. However, what happened to these men while they were making the forbidden visits, and how did they cope with the dangers lying in wait for them? One cannot find answers to this question in the community register. Moreover, it seems unlikely that we might find traces of those who asked forgiveness in Inquisition documents, since they succeeded in returning safely to Amsterdam. And it appears that the Inquisition failed to lay its hand on them. Although Franco de Silveira was a marginal figure in the history of the Amsterdam community, his life story can teach us a great deal about the connections and reciprocal relations between new Christians in the countries of Iberia in the Western Sephardic diaspora. On Sunday, the 22nd of February, 1665, after more than 3 years of exhausting interrogations by the inquisitors, the verdict was delivered in the trial of a new Christian named Cristobal Mendez at an auto da fe at the church of the monastery of San Pedro Martir in Toledo. Despite the severity of the sins of which he was found guilty, he was spared from burning at the stake. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, the practical meaning of which was several years of incarceration in an Inquisition jail, until it was decided that the prisoner had atoned for his sins. He was born in Seville in 1624 to new Christian parents from Portugal. His family had lived for generations in the city of Viseu. His parents, Arthur Mendes and Patrice Silveira, arrived in Andalusia with a mass migration that brought many hundreds of new Christians from Portugal to Spain, beginning the 1580s. At the age of 6 months, Cristobal moved with his family to the city of Cadiz, which attracted many converso merchants, especially those involved in trade with the colonies in the New World. He provided most of the details about his travels to the inquisitors in Madrid in his first interrogation on 18 August 1661, 15 days after he was caught in the streets of the capital and sent to jail. Cristobal asked to appear before the inquisitors in order to confess his sins and return to the bosom of the church. He was transferred to the Inquisition in Toledo, where he was examined by a surgeon who ascertained that he was circumcised. At the sessions of his trial before the Inquisition in Toledo, which took place between November 1661 and December 1664, he was interrogated very thoroughly. 2 days after the end of the trial, his sentence was read and it was alleviated in January 1665. When Cristobal was seized on the streets of Madrid on the 3rd of August 1661, suspicion of him had already mounted in the court of the Inquisition. In this testimony given before the tribunal of Francisco Domingo de Guzman in February 1661, the witness stated that he had met Cristobal Mendez in Madrid and that he identified him as one of the Jews whom he had formerly seen in Amsterdam. According to his testimony, one day Cristobal Mendez had come to him in his lodgings in Madrid in order to inquire into the circumstances of his presence in Spain. De Guzman, who had come to Madrid in order to return to Christianity after living as a Jew for many years, claimed to the investigators that Cristobal Mendez had threatened to murder him. While he was still on the way to Spain during a stopover in Paris, he heard from a relative about a secret plot to assassinate him by a number of Jews from Amsterdam who know of his intention to return to Christianity. De Guzman claimed that the plotters were afraid he would inform about dozens of Jews, most of whom had formerly been new Christians. De Guzman's incriminating testimony was corroborated by that of another witness, Joseph Garcia de Leon from Bordeaux, a new Christian from Bordeaux, who informed about 100 Jews whom he had met in Livorno, Amsterdam, and other places. Among the Jews he had seen in Amsterdam, he mentioned one Fulano Pastelada, whose father, Artur Mendez, so he said, had been imprisoned by the Inquisition with his daughter in 1646-47. Our hero, Cristobal Mendez, had apparently gained notoriety as an eater of cake, which is why he was given the nickname of Pastelada, from pastel, meaning cake or pastry in Spanish and Portuguese. Indeed, as described by Guzman, Cristobal was of medium age, husky and plump. Cristobal Mendez left Spain on 26th of March, 1643. He tried to create the impression that he had no initial intention of leaving Spain and abandoning Christianity. According to what he told the Inquisition, one day he left his father's house and impulsively joined up with two of his uncles who were sailing from Seville with their wives and children to Sanlúcar de Barrameda. However, it turned out that the journey did not end there. In Sanlúcar, Cristobal and his uncles embarked on an English ship which took them to Venice. The group reached Venice exactly a month after leaving Spain. They were welcomed by relatives and friends. And about 18 years later, while standing before the tribunal in Madrid, he still remembered the date of his circumcision. On that occasion, Cristobal also received his Hebrew name, Abraham, and henceforth he was known by his new name, Abraham Franco de Silveira. His uncle Abraham Suarez gave him a talit, a prayer shawl, a pair of phylacteries, tefillin, and a prayer book in Spanish translation. And 20 days later, when he recovered from the circumcision, he first attended the Sephardic synagogue in Venice. For the first time in his life, he wore the prayer shawl and phylacteries, and before the open holy hour, following the cantor, he recited the blessing, gratitude for recovery from danger. He lived in Venice for a whole year, and during that whole period, he prayed in the Sephardic synagogue. Although the main burden of the confession that Cristobal Mendez made before the tribunals in Madrid and Toledo revolved around the story of his life, it reveals interesting facts about the Jewish communities that he visited, as well as the names of about 80 Jews with information about their origin, their family relations, and their businesses. In Padua, his second stop in Italy, he lived for about a year and a half. He used to pray with a congregation, and there too, he went to the Sephardi synagogue every day, which he said was one of 3 synagogues that were active in the ghetto. Very few Jews prayed there. The Jewish population he found in the city was thin, and the ones who stood out were students who came from Venice and other places to study at the well-known local university. From Padua, he moved westward, and when he arrived in Verona on a Friday at noon, he stayed in that city to avoid desecrating the Shabbat. On his way to Florence, he stopped in Mantua, Modena, Guastalla, and Reggio. Although he knew that there were Jewish communities in all of these cities, he did not stop there, nor did he make contact with the local Jews. He remained in Florence for only 3 days, quote unquote, and he went to the Sephardic synagogue, which is maintained by the Jews in the ghetto, and he heard that there was also a synagogue that followed the Italian ritual. He continued to Livorno, where he stayed for 2.5 months. He was very impressed by the large number of Jews there who did not live in a ghetto, and by the size of the synagogue, but he only prayed there 2 or 3 times, because the building, despite of its size, could not accommodate all the local Jews, so that many of them were forced to pray outdoors near the synagogue. Cristobal Mendes headed to Amsterdam from Italy, knowing that in the Dutch metropolis he would find wealthy relatives upon whose support he hoped to depend. He traveled via France, although he knew that Jews were forbidden to live there. As early as the 16th century, new Christians had settled there, mainly in the southwest. Many of these secretly preserved Jewish customs, and some of the men were circumcised. In Cristobal Mendes' day, the merchants of the Nation Portuguese in Bordeaux and Bayonne maintained close connections with the communities of the Western Sephardi diaspora, especially the Talmud Torah congregation in Amsterdam. In Cristobal Mendes' confession before the Inquisition, he did not mention any contacts or meetings with the local Portuguese population. He told the Inquisition that he wanted to get to know France, so he stayed there for 6 months. He passed through Marseille, Arles, Montpellier, Béziers, Carcassonne, Toulouse, and Bordeaux, but he provided no details about his visit to these cities or about meetings with the local residents. Abraham Franco de Silveira arrived in Amsterdam in 1648, and according to his testimony to the court in Madrid, during his first interrogation, he lived in that city for 14 or 15 months until he departed on his next journey. He gave the Inquisition many details about the Jewish way of life during this chapter of his life. In Amsterdam, too, he took care to attend services in the Sephardic synagogue and to pray every day with members of the congregation. He mentioned the names of 41 Sephardic Jews in the city, including 8 women. As if the detailed account that Cristobal Mendes gave to the inquisitors about the severe transgression he committed against the Christian religion during the years he lived in the cities of Italy and Amsterdam were not enough, he added a comprehensive report about his secret visit to Spain in 1649. In August 1661, he had good reason to assume that the inquisitors already knew that 11 years earlier, he had gone to Spain to bring his stepmom, Felipa Núñez de Paz, and his sister Isabel to Amsterdam. Indeed, if he wanted to prevent the Inquisition from casting doubt about the sincerity of his intention to atone for his sins, he had to confess to all the transgressions that he assumed were already known to the investigators. Therefore, he told them in great detail about his secret voyage to Spain, which was also via France. Abraham Franco de Silveira did not remember whether he arrived in Amsterdam in January or February 1650. He began a new chapter in his life. After years of wandering, he finally settled down in the capital of the Dutch Republic, which had signed a peace treaty with Spain 2 years earlier. Abraham decided to marry and establish a family. About 2 years after his visit in Spain, his sister Isabel, who was now called Rachel, married Jacob da Silva, and on the same day, Abraham took his sister-in-law, Blanca de Silva, in matrimony. The ceremony of the two marriages was led by Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, and in his first confession to the tribunal in Madrid, Cristobal described the two weddings which took place one after the other in his house in Amsterdam, almost 10 years before he was captured by the Inquisition in Madrid. Abraham Franco de Silveira finally established a family at the age of 27, and it appears that he began to engage in business. Although he claimed to the Inquisition that he continued to be supported by charity, which he supposedly received from the community, he was not telling the truth, because he wished to conceal information about his activities as a merchant from the inquisitors and to keep his assets secret. He presented himself as a poor man supported by charity. However, the registers of the community accounts show that during these years, Abraham paid the Pinta, the dues levied on the members of the community, in the amount of 20 guilders per annum, showing that he was a man of moderate means. In some of those years, he also paid the imposta tax, which merchants set aside from their revenues in import and export, showing that he was an active merchant. Moreover, some of what he mentioned in passing to the inquisitors offers a glimpse into the extensive commercial activity apparently connected with Spain that he carried out in Amsterdam. From his detailed account of the Jewish life that he led, and from his familiarity with the Jewish holidays, he appeared to be an absolute Judaizer to the inquisitors. After leaving Spain, he became an observant Jew who maintained an orderly and regular Jewish way of life. He said repeatedly that he was scrupulous in observing all of the fasts according to the Hebrew calendar. And because of his piety, he occasionally observed personal fasts. He gave the Inquisition rich material about his life as a Jew from May 1643 to April 1660, the month that when he made his final trip to Spain, which was sufficient to incriminate him since he had committed severe transgressions against Catholics. What he said about himself left no room for doubt. Cristobal Mendez had betrayed the Catholic Church. He had denied the sacrament of baptism, which he had received as an infant, abandoned faith in Jesus the Messiah, became a heretic, and adhered to the law of Moses, whose authority had expired and which could not bring salvation. What impelled Abraham Franco de Silveira to leave Amsterdam in April 1660 and travel to Spain once again? What caused him to leave behind his wife and his two young daughters and to become involved in a dangerous adventure that exacted such a high price from him? From what he told during his trial and from various information that the Inquisition collected against him, it is difficult to offer a clear answer, though he apparently went for business reasons. His sojourn in Madrid lasted for about 10 months. He was aware that people he had met in Amsterdam, who had known him as an observant Jew, were liable to inform on him, but he did not act with the requisite caution. In one case, he even initiated a meeting with a man who had seen him living among Jews in Italy and Amsterdam. His habits were his undoing. Cristobal Mendez was careless, and on the 3rd of August, 1661, he was arrested in the streets of Madrid. The man who betrayed him to the Inquisition was Joseph Garcia de Leon, if we informed on dozens of former conversos who had returned to Judaism. Fulano Pastelada, the plump man who liked to eat pastry, was none other than Cristobal Mendez, one of the men he mentions in his report. The two met by chance in the Atocha quarter in Madrid, a few weeks after Joseph Garcia de Leon testified to the inquisitors. He immediately recognized Cristobal Mendez, began a conversation with him to distract him, and while they were talking, he pulled him to the Inquisition headquarters. As they drew near, he shouted for help and managed to drag Cristobal Mendez into the building. Everything took place at lightning speed, and Cristobal was thunderstruck. He had known the man who brought about his arrest from earlier meetings with him in Amsterdam, and it was clear to him that he would testify against him if he had not already done so. 2 weeks of incarceration in cell number 4 of the Inquisition in Madrid were sufficient to make him understand that his life was in jeopardy. Therefore, he decided to take the initiative and present his own version to the Inquisition. He knew he couldn't conceal the fact that he had lived abroad as a Jew for 18 years. On the contrary, rather than denying it, he would supply details as full as possible of the commandments he had observed, the ceremonies in which he had participated, so that no prosecution witness could surprise him and accuse him of a deed he had not already confessed. At the same time, in addition to the detailed confession, which was intended to convince the inquisitor that he had not kept any secrets to himself, and that the remorse he expressed was sincere and true, he decided to offer 2 arguments in principle, one about what he had not intended and one about what he had intended, as it were, with a whole heart. One, he had not left Spain with the intention of becoming Jewish. Two, he had now returned to Spain with the intention of asking forgiveness for his sins and to return to the bosom of the church, which he had abandoned impulsively. On 18 August, upon his own request, Cristobal Mendez was brought from his cell in order to make a statement before the Inquisition tribunal. At his first court appearance, he announced his desire to confess to all his sins and to ask forgiveness for his transgression against God and the Catholic Church, in hopes that the Holy Inquisition would show mercy toward him. The investigation and trial that the Inquisition waged against him lasted nearly 4 years, first in Madrid and then in Toledo. Several witnesses testified against Cristobal Mendez, including testimony recorded in Seville, Malaga, Cadiz, Granada, and elsewhere. And they filled in the picture, leaving no room for doubt. He was found guilty of serious acts of heresy. It was proven beyond any doubt that for a long time he had acted like a Judaizer in every way. Against the claim that he had not left Spain with the intention of living openly as a Jew, the Inquisitor collected evidence from various sources. As for the second claim, that he supposedly returned to Spain in order to turn himself over to the Inquisition, and that he planned to do so when he crossed the border from France to the Basque town of Irún, it sounded preposterous and inconsistent with his subsequent behavior. He had lived in and around Madrid for about 10 months, and who was stopping him from taking this step and confessing to his sin on his own initiative? This was not the only point where Cristobal's confession was found insincere and unbelievable. The tribunal in Toledo found that he had hidden the most important information of all. He did not tell them that he had begun to observe Jewish commandments 5 years before leaving Spain, so that the whole story about his departure for Venice sounded dubious and untruthful. Time after time, the inquisitors pleaded with him to tell the whole truth, but Cristobal repeatedly claimed that he had told them everything he had to say and had nothing to add. Not even the threat of torture achieved its goal. Cristobal did not break, but surprisingly, the inquisitors were in no hurry to subject him to torture. A turning point came on December 1661. At the morning session of the tribunal, it was hinted that the inquisitor possessed firm evidence that proved he was concealing grave deeds from his past. They gave him to understand that it was known to them that in 1642, in the city of Cadiz, he had confessed to believe in the law of Moses before 6 other persons, with whom he observed the Shabbat and refrained from eating pork. The long imprisonment and psychological pressure took their toll. Cristobal Mendez announced he was willing to confess and clear his conscience. He confessed that in 1638, when he was in the city of Avila, he began to observe the law of Moses. He was then 15, and at that time his father asked him if he was willing to fast with him, and after Cristobal said that he was, his father told him for the first time that he was a Jew who observed the law of Moses. Cristóbal Mendes knew that his new confessions, which included grave disclosures, greatly complicated his situation. In the light of his words about his last 5 years in Spain, it was clear to everyone that his departure for Venice in 1643 was no coincidence. And in fact, he had fled from Spain with several members of his family, with whom he had regularly performed ceremonies according to the law of Moses. Considering these facts from the Inquisition made his situation desperate, and he had good reason to fear for his life. He begged the court for forgiveness and mercy for hiding all these actions until the last moment. He said that he did it to protect his father so that his bones would not be removed from the grave and burned in an auto da fe. In fact, his latest confessions to the Inquisition tribunal in Toledo told the inquisitors nothing that they did not already know. They were very informed, very well informed about the circle of Judaizers to which he had belonged, who used to convene in various settlements in Andalusia. Not only that they knew something else about Cristóbal Mendes, which was graver than all the rest. In an auto da fe that took place in Toledo in January 1651, while Cristóbal Mendes was living in Amsterdam, his sentence was proclaimed, including the trial held against him in the Inquisition Tribunal of Seville. Cristóbal Mendes was tried in absentia, and as a criminal at large, he was found guilty of the gravest transgression against the Catholic Church. He was sentenced to death and burned in effigy. In the light of the foregoing, and considering that Cristóbal had been sentenced to be burned at the stake in an earlier Inquisition trial, the new sentence passed against him was mild and unexpected. When on the 20th of January 1665, he heard the final revised sentence, he could breathe a sigh of relief and regard himself as born anew. He knew that the actual meaning of the life sentence passed against him was incarceration in an Inquisition prison for just a few years. A few months later, the first report was delivered regarding his progress in study of Catholic dogma and his behavior as a prisoner. The monk making the report noted with satisfaction that Cristóbal Mendes had passed the first examination and shown satisfactory knowledge of the mysteries of the Christian faith. On 19 May 1668, a letter was received by the Inquisition court in Toledo regarding Cristóbal Mendes, signed by Everardo Nitar, the German head inquisitor of Spain and the Queen's confessor. Nitar expressed satisfaction with the progress shown by Cristóbal Mendes in atoning for his sins and with his submissive mode of life in prison. He had received reports about the obedience with which he had fulfilled all the directives of the Inquisition, and in consideration of this, he commuted his sentence. He gave the order to release Cristóbal Mendes from prison and to exempt him from the obligation to wear the San Benito. Instead, he was to observe fasts, pilgrimages, and special prayer to complete the process of atonement for his sin. At that very time, a few days before his release from prison, Cristobal Mendez addressed the court in Toledo and asked to be recognized as an unmarried man eligible to marry. In a letter in his own hand, signed by him, he claimed to the Inquisition that he had married his wife Blanca according to Jewish law, but they had not been together for years, and there was no chance that his wife would accept the Christian religion. Considering that he and his wife were fourth-degree relatives, making their marriage illegal according to Catholic law, he asked to have it annulled so he could marry a Catholic woman. It is not known whether this request was answered, and no reference to it was found in his Inquisition dossier. What happened to Cristobal Mendez after that? He managed to leave Spain. Where did he go? Did he go back to France and join the Portuguese New Christians in Bayonne and Bordeaux, whom he had met on earlier occasion? Or did he sail from some port in Andalusia to a colony in the New World? Did he fulfill his desire to marry another woman? 5 years of his biography remain a total mystery. But why only 5? Because we discovered traces of Cristobal Mendez at the end of 1676. The man we discovered in that year is Abraham Franco Silveira, who returned to Amsterdam after an absence of nearly 16 years. There he found, to his surprise, that the Jews had built a new synagogue, the famous Snocha, a large and splendid building which had been inaugurated with much pomp in 1675. He went to the synagogue in December 1676 in order to stand on the pulpit and ask forgiveness upon orders from the Parnasim in public, quote unquote, from the master of the universe, from his holy Torah, for the evil I have done by going and dwelling in the lands of idolatry. Once again, he had to express remorse and proclaim his willingness to accept submissively the punishment imposed upon him, this time by the heads of the Sephardic community of Amsterdam. Within a short time, he once again paid his membership dues in the community, which were far lower than what he had paid in the town. He died in Amsterdam the 25th of April, 1703, and was buried in the Sephardic cemetery in Ouderkerk. It is doubtful whether any of those who attended his funeral knew the secret of his life.
You're not in the party too. Thank you very much for this exciting story that reconstructs the journey of a 17th century conversion, offering us a true detective story. Years ago, when I had the honor and pleasure of being part of the research group you mentioned at the Skolnion Mandel Institute, together with Professor Kaplan, one of my greatest pleasures consisted of casual conversations in the corridors or at coffee time. On one such day, I asked Yosef what he was working on. With a noticeable twinkle in his eye and a broad smile, he told me that he was following in the footsteps of a converso, and that this work would be the pinnacle of his career. I confess that I was astonished by the statement, being aware of the importance and magnitude of the research carried out and already published, a work that has marked the course of historiography on the Western Sephardic diaspora. Today, I can perfectly understand the reason for that statement, and not only for it, but also for the passion expressed by Yosef for this itinerant. In the first place, Cristóbal Méndez, or should we call him Abraham Franco de Silveira, embodies through his life the interests and concerns that drove Yosef's research. To rescue the stories and the voices of these individuals whose main objective, as was pointed out, was simply to survive in an almost impossible reality, to preserve their physical integrity while striving to maintain the faith to which they had decided to return. This in no way implies idealizing these individuals, much less considering them martyrs. Quite the contrary. The example of Cristóbal Méndez manages to show, thanks to the meticulous and careful monitoring of the documents, as well as the illuminating analysis, what Yosef Kaplan has taught us to appreciate, and that we literary scholars verify again and again through their literary creation. I apologize. The complexity of the identities of the new Christians and the new Jews, the diversity of the cases, the importance of being cautious in judging what in appearance seems to be a deceitful, purely accommodating ambivalence. In my humble view, and of course, not being an historian, the path taken by Yosef Kaplan from the macro history of the new Iberian Jews of Amsterdam converges in the micro history of the individuals with names, voices, and exciting and concrete destinies that come to confirm, to materialize his so important investigations of several decades. And one more observation in this respect. Cristóbal Méndez demonstrates irrefutably that the task of the historian is not so far from that of the detective. And I believe that Yosef also has a certain Sherlock Holmes vocation. But there is more. Now, from the perspective of a researcher dedicated to literature with an emphasis on the work of Cervantes. Listening to Yosef's work, I could not help but think of that second author of Don Quixote, who cannot admit that the story of Don Quixote remains unfinished, and goes out to Toledo in search of its continuation, rummaging through old papers until he finds what he was looking for and continue the story. I could not help but think of Yosef as that stubborn author who is not satisfied with the dry data of the inquisitorial and other declarations and goes to search and dive to give continuity to his story. In doing so, he demonstrates once again to what extent our disciplines dialogue with each other and complement each other. Moreover, I fervently hope that the fiction writer capable of turning this story discovered and analyzed by Yosef into a marvelous novel will appear in the near future.
In the next place.
Our protagonist deserves it. Finally, the words of the author beloved by Yosef, the Uruguayan Juan Carlos Sonetti, resounds in my ears when he tells us, quote, "I have already said many times that writing is an act of love, and without an euphemism. Indeed, writing literature and writing history are acts of love, and Yosef Kaplan has given us today a masterly lesson on such writing." Thank you.
Thank you for mentioning Sonetti. As you know, so I am one of the greatest admirers of Sonetti. And I repeat very often, I quote him very often when he says, "Todo tiene remedio sin garantía de felicidad. Ni siquiera que el remedio sea mejor que la desgracia."
Thank you so much, Joseph, for this introduction, keynote lecture, for this wonderful keynote lecture, and thank you for your comment. Do we still have, we started a bit late, but are
We
more or less-
technically
we
have
want to continue
3
with-
minutes for questions and comments.
We have 3 minutes for questions, so the floor is open. Keep your questions short and keep your answers short.
I happen to remember Pastelada, and I did a word search on, in my book. I didn't mention that he was called Pastelada, which I regret. But the fact that he was plump and that he obviously had access to pastries reminds me that a lot of the men who filled his shoes, or whose shoes he filled, were people who were actually, in a sense, well off. They weren't doing fantastically, but they were okay. And it is hard to understand from that standpoint that they were desperate and they lived in a very, very tumultuous and dangerous world. So I'm just struck by the dissonance there. You know, a plump, happy man who likes pastries, who's called Pastelada, is actually in danger for his life. That's an interesting context.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have 2 questions. I think this is perfect. So ask the
Shall I start?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I have the impression of having watched a wonderful movie right now. And I just want to make a very short remark, and that is that at the Auto da Fe in Toledo in January 1651, Pastelada was in an excellent company because they burnt also the statue of the poet Antonio Enriquez Gomez. So those two met as puppets in the inquisitorial theater.
That's exactly what I was going to talk about. But I was wondering, I've been wondering about this for a long time. Aren't they clues about the danger? Because there are so many people who do this. They went to Amsterdam, they went back to Spain, and felt like Antonio Enriquez Gomez, investing in the States. Weren't they all, it was very risky, very dangerous, but weren't they thrilled with the danger? And weren't they having a side of threat, anxiety, that's a bit of segment? That's always what occurred to me.
Yes, look, I'm fascinated by this story because there are so many signs of interrogation there. He was a pastelada and a martyr of the Inquisition, but he was a great liar. And the question that I asked myself so many years, wondering, after he was released by the Inquisition, was he wandering alone or with a Catholic woman that he married? And then think about it, coming back to Amsterdam and think for the first time, the synagogue, when he left, the Jews prayed in a relatively modest building. And now in 1675, they have this majestic building, one of the most impressive synagogues in Europe. And so I think that, as you said, that there is really, I lost my sympathy for Gerard Depardieu. But Gerard Depardieu would probably be a good interpreter of the man who like to eat cakes.
I take this as a closing remark, a wonderful closing remark. Thank you very much again.
Yeah. Just 3 minutes.
Can we have?
Yeah. Three, yeah. Those who wants to go to the temple of the modern man.
There is a drill that, so because.
Gracias.
There's hiding. They also have gone back to raising any.
Viva pastelada. No, esto es para nosotros. Afuera hay otra.
Anime cabeza, Batman, increíble, compañera, hijo, cada uno a su manera, alumno, en toda la universidad todavía
Pretty sure that I don't think it made. I don't think it's. Oh my God, it's safe.
I'm the chair, James Nelson, Christiana Facchini, and Matt Goldish. So the three who will present.
Nuestro, pero de España, dominicano, de acá está allá. Tengo
Yeah, we great. Love images, especially the.
I suggest that we sit down so as not to get too far behind schedule.
Yeah. Yes.
Please take your seats so that we don't delay. Enjoy the pastelada while you're seated. Everyone, we are resuming.
Please.
Shall I be strict to the time?
I'll leave it.
Okay.
More or less. We know already. What did you say? There is. Wait. Go with.
Yeah.
Allora, facciamo.
Please take your seats. We're starting again. I'm gonna have to get people by name. Please take your seats.
Okay. Oh my God.
David.
I need help with it.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Is it down to the internet?
Good idea.
No?
So welcome for our first panel. I am Carsten Wilke of Central European University in Vienna. And it is my great pleasure to chair this first panel and to introduce three dear colleagues. The title is Polemics and Apologetics in the Western Diaspora, Local, Regional, and Trans-Regional Cases. And we must admire the wisdom of the organizers of this conference, of guiding us from one pole to the other of our topic, from Jerusalem and the homage that we paid to a great scholar of the Hebrew University, all the way to Rome, because this panel will focus on the historical, geographical context of polemics and apologetics by looking in particular on personalities who were involved in this part of their lives in the life of the Jewish communities of Italy. The first presenter is James Nelson Rohr. James is Associate Professor of Modern Languages and Literatures at the University of Ottawa in Canada. He received his PhD in Spanish philology from the University of Valencia in Spain in 2003. And he is the author of the authoritative study on New Christians in Rome that was published in 2014 under the title Beings in a Nação in the Eternal City, Portuguese New Christian Lives in 16th Century Rome. And he has also published about 55 articles in journals and collected volumes. His areas of primary interest are the Italo-Iberian cultural relations in the early modern period. He has worked on literary as well as historical topics. He has worked on earlier European interests in the Americas and the Portuguese New Christian diaspora in Italy in the 16th and the 17th century. And we are entering
directly the topic of polemics with his lecture today, anti-converso polemics in Rome, 1532 to 1605. Please, Jim.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It's very daunting to follow an act as masterful as that of my one time and always teacher, Jose Kaplan, and also to be the first speaker of this, well, first presenter at this conference. So hopefully it'll only get better. I want to thank the organizers. I want to thank the Institute for Advanced Study, right, for all of their endeavors in organizing this this meeting, right, in hosting us. The names of the actual people involved, I think, will be spelled out in detail, but I know that there's a lot of unsung heroes that are part of bringing something like this together that I think should be recognized, right? And I'm especially thankful, of course, to my dear friends and colleagues, like Claude and David, and to you for I'm in a room filled with people that have helped me so much, have given me so much over these years. So it's very humbling to be invited to speak. I have to begin apologizing for changing the title of my lecture, right? It went from being more limited, let's say chronologically, to a more general title. Now, Converso Polemics in Rome. And today, I wanted to deal not so much with apologetics or even polemics as such, right? I'm not going to really be dealing with specific texts or writings, right? Specific apologetic texts or writing, just kind of en passant, but more with a specific context, a context which is not inconsequential for us, right? That of Rome, right? And the way in which Converso identity, and David Masterfully dealt and quote as well in the introductions with how the whole problem of identity and this idea of identity maybe not being necessarily fluid, right? But identity is something that is crystallized in a situation, right? So I want to kind of deal with the situation that Rome put people in on different levels, right? So it's more of a general overview, and hopefully by the time this becomes a written, publishable essay contribution, I'll be able to be a bit more concise and precise, right? Ruled over by an elected spiritual monarch, right? A body and soul, as in the now classic study of the early modern papacy by Paolo Prodi. Rome was at once a princely court and state in the Italian peninsula and the overseer of the Universal Roman Church. And it is in this central context for Converso apologetics that I want to kind of flesh out the importance of the presence of not just new Christians, but also the new Christian question, right? The new Christian problem in Rome that really comes to a head at the beginning of the 16th century. I mean, the big heyday of that problem is, of course, with the introduction of the Portuguese Inquisition, and we all know about the struggle, the diplomatic struggle that Rome as a stage on which it takes place, right? This has been told, the story has been told first by Herculano and then more recently by Giuseppe Marcocci, right? So the whole new Christian question is really placed on that Roman stage at that moment, right? And the centrality of Rome, I think, is important for a kind of crystallization of several possible identities that will play out throughout the 16th and the 17th centuries, right? Those are the centuries in which I'm going to overlap or deal with. I don't know how to scroll down. I want to deal then with a few themes, right, that I at least want to touch on, not exhaustively, but at least want to throw out and consider, right? Namely, how and in what ways did Iberian conversos influence Roman policy? We'll kind of see what that means, and discourse regarding religious conversion. In what ways could conversos have been present, right? And an issue, right? And the problem, right, of conversos have been an issue both in the city of Rome and in the kind of universal Catholicosphere at this moment in time, right? Did Roman policy really change over time, and why? And I wanted to present a few, only three, concrete examples of polemics on both sides, for and against, right? To kind of take up the problem of how they may have circulated in the Roman context, and by whom, right? In what ways? So I think we have to begin understanding or dealing with the specificity of the context at hand with Rome, right? As an imbricated space where several realities exist, right? Are shared. I just canceled my this. How do I go?
The other way.
The other one.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can really speak about several Romes in a sense, right? On the one hand, we had the papacy, right? Rome as the papacy, the seat of the papacy, the Holy See, right? Which depends on the reigning incumbent of the throne of St. Peter, right? The pontiff, for its shifting politics and policies. On another level, Rome also meant the different offices of the complex bureaucracy of the Catholic Church, including the Roman Curia in the world, right? That kind of oversaw the functioning of Catholicism on a global level, based in Rome. And on the other hand, the city of Rome itself, right? That technically is ruled as a theocracy, right? The ultimate leader is the Pope, but Rome exists on a civic level, right? So on the one hand, ruled over by this elected prince, right? But that had its own recognized civic government, separate, right? And also foreign institutions, so ways of being foreign, contexts of being foreign in the city, such as national churches and confraternities. The whole converso question was really thrust into the papal radar by events in Iberia. The Roman position had always been that to accept and incentivate the conversion of Jews, and that once converted, they were to be deemed legitimate Christians until proven otherwise. We all know the Sentencia Estado of Toledo, right, of 1449, is a case in point, right? The response to that first evocation of purity of blood statutes was Nicholas V's bull of 1449, shortly afterwards, denouncing this distinction, right, of new and old Christian. And then the 16th and 17th century saw constant changes in the response to, in particular, the Portuguese Inquisition and its application, reversals and alterations of papal policy regarding Iberian conversos. Often the changes in policy were the result of various veritable politics or politicking, right, lobbying, on the part of both representatives of New Christians and the crowns of Castile and Portugal and their representatives. And an early papal bull, right, Cupientes Judeus of the 1st of March, 1542, by Paul III, defends the legitimacy of converts from Judaism, right? There's no question there, right? There is no distinction between old and new Christians, right? And their descendants as true Christians. It makes provision for them to be instructed in the faith, right? This papal document, while insisting at the same time that if they are to relapse, they are to be published as heretics, as Judaizers. So the year is important, right? 1542. We have to see it in a sense as a response to 1536, like the establishment of the Inquisition in Portugal. It's important to consider that in this sense, then, that there's Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, is no longer on the periphery, but it finally arrives in Rome, right? And it's the center of debate and deliberation in Rome. And especially when new Christians start arriving on Italian soil, right? So on the Pope's terrain, so to speak. Some of all these dates, I'm sure, are known to most of you. I just want to sort of reiterate or refer them again, right? In 1497, there's an initial, we don't know much about it. There's a decree on the part of the Venetian Senate for the expulsion of Marranos from Venice. It's unclear what that actually means, right? But the decree at least exists. They're first invited, new Christians, not new Jews, right? To the papal port city of Ancona as Levantini, right? The subjects of the Ottomans, of the Ottoman Sultan, right? And 4 years later, they're invited to the Duchy of Ferrara. And in 1549, they're invited to the Duchy of Tuscany by Cosimo de' Medici to settle in Pisa. This all becomes complicated when, at the end of the 16th century, we have full-fledged new Jewish Ponentine communities in Italy, right? And the first invitation that sanctions, recognizing that these people were formerly new Christians that have become Jews, was on the part of Venice, right, in 1589. And in another watershed invitation, 1591-93, the so-called Legge Livornine, right? And it specifically states in its invitation by Ferdinando, right, that even if previous to arriving here, they had been a Christian, right, they can live here now as Jews. So it effectively both measures sanction the arrival of apostates who can live as openly as Jews on Italian soil, right? It's really the only two places at the end of the 16th century where this is possible. It's important to not lose sight of this. At the same time, right, that this is happening, right, that these invitations are being made out to new Christians, and then at the end of the century to new Jews, we have a kind of reconsolidation of a tribunal that had been dormant, that of the Papal Inquisition or the Roman Inquisition, right? That is reconstituted as a congregation of the Holy Office in 1542, right? To kind of oversee orthodoxy, not just in Rome, the city of Rome, right? But in throughout the Italian peninsula, right? At the outset, and this is an institution that in a very real sense still exists, right? As now the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, not congregation anymore, right? So new Christians were not at first a major concern or priority for the Holy Office. Roman Inquisition mainly begins as a response, of course, to Protestantism, right? As an Italian Inquisition, though, it had, and this is an expression of Christopher Black, right? It had competence throughout the Italian peninsula, or most of the Italian peninsula, right? Sicily is a different, and Sardinia a different matter, and also Naples, right? through a complex system of local tribunals and commissaries, so tentacles of the Inquisition, right? Over the centuries, there were numerous cases of trials against Judaizers, and Pier Cesarioli Zoratini gives 2.3% for the trials between 1541 to 1600 in Venice, and afterwards from 1600 to 1800 in the case of Venice, only 30 cases regarding Judaizers, right? No systematic study has been done regarding the Tribunal of Pisa about Judaizers, right, over the centuries, but we know that there was a series of investigations that take place between 1594 and 1600 that involve about 10 trials regarding Judaizers, kind of as a result of the arrival, right, following the heels of these Leggi Livornine, right, as a response. What about Rome, the city, right? So no longer the papacy, no longer the Inquisition, right? But civic Rome, right? Civic Rome was overseen by an official called the governor of the city, who never institutes an edict, right? Never puts out an edict or any kind of proclamation regarding new Christians, either restricting them or signaling them as a distinct group, right? To be recognized as a distinct group. There were never any new Christian confraternities, for example, or official recognition of them as a nazione, as a distinct national group, right? And there were other examples of groups like Croatians, English or Irish, right? That end up being recognized, that don't always have national states, right? So that could have been an option, but it is never the case, right? And we know that there are numerous examples in consulting the documentation, the archival documentation of new Christians who become Roman citizens, so no impediment whatsoever, or hold sometimes prestigious offices, civic offices in the local rioni, right, the local neighborhoods or quarters of Rome. There were, and there still are, national Iberian churches, national churches in general, right? These were churches that serve as the kind of public face of the different naziones recognized by Rome. There were 3 Iberian churches, right? San Giacomo dei Spagnoli, Santa Maria in Monserrato for the Aragonese, and of course, Sant'Antonio dei Portuguesi, which never imposed blood purity statutes in these churches, that it would impede people from joining the congregations, right? And if we study the congregation records in the cases of these churches, we can find conversos who are able to join them, right? They're never mentioned at all in the subsequent statutes that come out in these churches from the 15th to the 18th centuries, right? As a presence there, even though they were, right, present. We know that at the end, following the expulsion of 1492, that there were communities, that scuole that arise in Rome, right, with the Castilian and Aragonese, right? What was not possible in Rome was to convert or revert to Judaism if one was a baptized Catholic, right? And after the 1555 creation of the ghetto, it becomes even more difficult to intermingle, to have contact, right? Studying the kind of parish records of the Diocese of Rome, it would seem, and I'm working throughout the 17th century, right, until I've dealing, kind of fleshing out the presence of these people. The quarter of choice that I find in these records where they live is the parishes of Parione. That's to say this part of the city near Piazza Navona, near the Castilian church of San Giacomo, right? This is inevitably where they live. I wanted to speak about Rome as a center for the dissemination of polemical texts, right? And we know that over the centuries, numerous texts were published, pamphlets circulated, memoriales were presented to the papal court, the curia, right? With a view to influencing official policy or winning over different factions, right? And the seat of the Roman Catholic Church was an important venue for presenting these views or currying favor, right, in places of origin. One is the well-known Memorial of so mentioned by Herculano, right? A series of texts that are presented in Rome. The original is to be found in the Vatican Library, right? Around 1544, and presented by New Christian agents. And we know that this at least influenced policy regarding the Inquisition. It kind of allowed for a stay, freeze, say, on the activities of the Inquisition in these years, right? 44, 48. Another obscure text that we know literally nothing about is this curious text, the Globus Canonum et Arcanorum Linguae Sanctae, written by a Portuguese Franciscan. I've tried to find information in the Franciscan archive in Rome, and there is nothing. What it is, it's at once a Hebrew grammar, a kind of exposition of the Hebrew Kabbalah and Hebrew mysticism, right? Where clearly his sources are Christian Hebraists and Kabbalists of the 16th century, dedicated to the then Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici. And of course, it offers an extensive refutation of the errors of Jews and calls for them conversion, right? But most of it is a Hebrew grammar. So polemical work written by a Portuguese. And although he doesn't seem to mention conversos explicitly, right, in the text, nonetheless, they can't have been, the concern can't have been very far from his preoccupations, right? And the text that I've worked with Claude over the years, the Apologia, right, an unpublished text that's still in the library of Roberto Bachmann, dedicated to Pope Urban VIII, right, supplicating the pontiff to take sides against the ongoing persecution in the Nassau of the Nassau in Portugal. We worked on this translation. I lost many hairs translating this devilishly complicated text, right? It offers, what it does is offer a kind of stalwart defense of Portugal's new Christians, right? And provides an account of the treatment of Iberia's Jews throughout the Middle Ages and their plight and discrimination. And I have found no evidence of the arrival of this text in Rome, right? So it's anyone's guess whether in fact it arrived. Converso discourse and polemics played out in different ways in these imbricated Romes. On the one hand, the papacy oversaw the entire Catholic Church, Iberia included, and had to include it in its deliberations, receiving requests and supplications from all sides of the converso issue and problem. The pontiff was, as a temporal ruler, concerned with what was happening in his backyard in the peninsula. The threat of apostates encroaching upon Catholic orthodoxy was of great concern, especially their potential to lead other conversos to renege, or even to make bona fide Catholics dangerously curious about Judaism. The pontiff was the inheritor of a long-standing tradition of encouragement and coercion into conversion, after which neophytes are to be indoctrinated and confirmed. Monetary awards were part of the enticement as well. And there are numerous, there are examples, very curious examples of inquisitorial trials against people who get baptized several times to receive money, right? In Venice and in other tribunals, right? So rebaptism or multiple baptism, right? And an example in the Italian, in the case of Rome, right, is the Boncompagni Corcos family. Following the conversion of Solomon Corcos in 1582, baptized with the family name of Ugo Boncompagni, the reigning Pope Gregory XIII, right? This family became a prestigious Roman Christian family noted for their art patronage. Examples also abound of Iberian conversos, art patronage and cultural patronage in the Eternal City at the same time. Their penetration and integration into the civic and social fabric of the city is evinced on many occasions. The general apparent silence regarding their complicated pasts speaks loudly about their ability to intertwine and become part of Roman society. Given the central importance of Rome, it should come as no surprise that it were to be chosen as the venue to have texts like these three circulated or purport to be circulated in manuscript or in print. Even if the anonymous apologia never actually made it to Rome, the evocation of a dedication to the Pope attests to the importance of that context. Whether explicit or silent, New Christians were present in the affairs of the Holy See and the Eternal City throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. From that vantage point, they're able to influence the polemics regarding themselves in the four corners of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for guiding us through this uncharted territory of the memoirs on the conversos, or by the conversos, that had a certain impact on the political struggle around them. So we have another, I think, 5 to 10 minutes left for discussions, for questions. Claude, yes?
Yes, two things. Of course, in the span of time, you didn't have the time, but of course we can, among others, we cannot avoid to tell about the politics of the papacy itself, whether the papacy was influenced by Spanish interest or by French interest. This has a lot of influence regarding the perception of the papacy vis-a-vis the New Christians, and even of Portugal, of Spain, and the negotiations who went around. This is among many others. But my main point is that years ago, when I first read the opus magnum of Antonio Manuel España, Vísperas de Leviatán, in which he maps the early modern Portugal society as a society of different kinds of corporations, and not centralized society, plenty of comparison. There is no word about the conversos, about the converso nação. And I wonder why. It is because España was not sensible to that. Then after hearing you, my response is that even though in Portugal, the nação was considered in sometimes as a kind of de facto corporation, it was hard to consider it as a de jure one. And it was that is, when you deal with questions of heresy, this is one thing, but when you dealt with questions of policy, of economics, and so on, that is why the name Men of the Nation could be sometimes be a kind of compromise. Everyone knew that many of the men of the nations were perhaps conversos, but you could not juridically adopt that. And this perhaps explain why what you said, why in Rome, converso representatives, they came as members of the so-called, it was always, so-called, because they don't want it to be a new Christian, but they so-called by the others, by their enemies, new Christians on the one hand, and still you don't have confraternities of new Christians in Rome. This illuminates a lot, as I think, the question of converso identity in the Catholic world. Thank you.
I mean, there's never an explicit, let's say, invitation, right, to have them come to Rome, like these other Ancona, Pisa. But in 1535, there's a papal brief that is made out, making provision for representatives to come to Rome to challenge decisions by the Holy Office in Portugal to defend them, right? So relatives or even friends of any sex, I think it was, I don't recall the exact day, but July of 1535, it's a brief by Paul III, right? And while Nazione isn't mentioned in the brief, it's giving them the kind of representation, political and legal representation, right? That other groups could have in Rome, right? So I think it's important to take that into consideration, right? When we deal with self-representation of a group.
Thank you. José Alberto.
I think that we deal with two problems. One is the question of the conversion in Portugal. So the legitimation of the conversion that from the time of Dom Manuel.
Yes.
And the problem of the marriage, what is happening to these people that were Jews and they become, suddenly they become Christians without catechization in the time of Dom Manuel. So, and when these people write these texts in Rome, I feel that they are thinking about the conversion of the Jews in Italy. It is another question, because we can see this in the writers of people that come from Italy, as João Batista Teste. This is also reflected in their texts concerning the solution of the conversion problem in Portugal. The solution sometimes is the expulsion of the conversions from Portugal, as it happens in Spain with the Moriscos. Sometimes it's the same solution. So, but I feel when these people is writing these texts in Italy, they are thinking also in the problem of the conversion of the Jews in Rome, because there is a lot of people writing about the conversion. Mostly are Jews that convert to Catholicism, and there is a lot of texts like this in Rome. Published, but concerning the solution of the Jews in Italy, the conversion of the Jews. But this affects in Portugal concerning the
Okay, thank you.
It's not a specific word to refer to them, right?
What's that?
It's not specific word to define the thing
They say usually in the papal documents, it's the so-called new Christians, right? So ex perfidia conversi, so from people, this group that has converted from the perfidy of Judaism to Christianity.
But in Rome, because other cities are.
Yeah,
different.
yeah. But these are, I'm speaking about, in this case, these are papal documents, right? So they regard the world, not just, right? But in the city of Rome, when the few times they come up in let's say trials of the governor of Rome, I've seen them referred to as Nazione dei Cristiani Novelli or Cristiani Nuovi, right? So there is this kind of idea that there's in some way they're kind of different, but they're kind of different because there's a greater kind of Iberian context that makes them different, not because you understand that separates them from.
Yeah, thank you. We're already over time, but I think we still have a moment for two short questions by Francisco Betancourt and Moses.
the notation. But I'll try to do it as short as possible. So it's impeccable, and the author's invention and you showed very well that new Christians were not important at all. They were the label new Christians didn't exist in all these examples. So there's nothing to say about that. What I wanted to comment was on the other side of this point, because they were really important from a financial point of view, from a cultural point of view, and from a juridic, legal point of view. And because Rome is the big hub of finances in the Catholic Church, and they control a huge part of the financial institutions of the people. Second, they fast became counts and marquises in Rome. They really were at the top. The flagship of Max Mara, the fashion shop, is in a small fraction of the big block owned by the Marquis of Cantelupo, Francisco Nunes Church. That's just a fraction. the confraternities, they didn't need to organize new confraternities because they were controlling the confraternities of the Portuguese and
Yes, yeah, yeah,
so.
yeah, yeah.
And they also had a foot in the church of the Irish, the Catholic.
Through the seal.
So, and finally, the legal issue in this document. I think they all circulated in the document. They would end up, your apology, would end up in the Cardinal's archive, probably. I think the presence of the Eucharists in the world is so overwhelming. They really had, I'm not saying that they were defeated at the end, but that they circulated everything. They had a presence there from a legal point of view. And that's one of the things I tried to push, was to show how important they were from a legal point of view.
Yeah.
And how they really conquered from that legal fight against Inquisition. They conquered it. They didn't conquer it in Portugal. But in
Right,
Europe,
yeah. In fact, the subject of my next book is gonna regards the 17th century, so it's that, right, that whole story that's, yeah. So thanks.
Yes, if you can tell us about the contradiction between the policy of the Inquisition and the Livornina. Because, you know, all the invitation to merchants to come to see the Toscana was that they
It was
were
very,
going
it
to
was
give
very
so many-
complicated, and remember the Livornine were created by an ex-cardinal, right, Ferdinando,
Right,
who had many connections still, even though when he becomes Grand Duke, right, after the death of Francesco, he has to renounce the cardinalate, but he'd lived in Rome for close to 20 years, he had many connections, and he has to constantly defend the fact that, yes, they are apostates, but they're useful. I mean, he comes under fire, that those series of investigations that start in 1594 and really end in 1600, right? The first series of investigations, he has to be constantly insist that it looks like apostasy, it smells like apostasy, but it might be something else.
but
It's not easy. It's a very complicated issue for him, right?
but very few cases, right?
In the Diocesan Archive of Pisa, I think there are about 10 cases. There are not that many, right? But still they're important, right? It really becomes the preoccupation of the tribunal in those
Yeah.
last decades.
James, thank you for your lecture and for your answers to this discussion. I'm glad to introduce our second speaker, Cristiana Facchini, who is professor of the history of Christianity and religious studies at the University of Bologna. She earned her PhD in Jewish studies at the University of Torino, and she has been a visiting faculty at the universities of Bielefeld and of Haifa here in Israel, and a research fellow at a number of different research institutes in Erfurt, in Oxford, at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And this term, she is a research fellow here with us at IIS. Her research interests include the history of Jews and Christians in the early modern and modern periods. And she has in particular analyzed the history of preaching, of religious enthusiasm, and Jewish anti-Christian polemics, as well as the Catholic expressions of hostility towards Jews. At the moment, she is preparing to co-editing two collective volumes, one on urban religion and another on the reception of Jesus in various religions during the 19th century. She also has written various articles devoted to Jews and religious minorities in the city, and is preparing others. Her lecture is titled A Journey Through Jewish Apologetics and Catholic Polemics, the Italian Case in the Baroque Period. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here, and I will try to be fast because we don't have much time, and I will not read, but I will show you what I am trying to do, and also what I will try to write. Is this painting you see here? It's a painting, you probably see it very well. It's a painting entitled Synagogue, which at the moment at the Art Institute of Chicago, painted maybe around 1725 and 35 by Italian artist Alessandro Magnasco. And it depicts a synagogue with ritual or something in the synagogue. And why do I start with this painting? I start with this painting because Magnasco painted many, there are different paintings devoted to synagogues, and there are paintings devoted to Quakers, and there are paintings, of course, devoted to religious daily life of the Catholic orders. So my idea was, when I encountered this material, that there was a certain interest in Italy at the beginning of the 18th century toward religious rituals that were of different religious groups and not necessarily or exclusively of the Catholic Church. There's a debate over the sources, but I will not go into that. So in order to say something about Jewish apologetics and Catholic polemics, I will actually start from the early 17th century and from a very important text which was published by Leon Modena first in 1636 and then 1638 in Venice. Has two different versions, Storia dei Riti Ebraici, Storia degli Riti Ebraici. There are two manuscripts. One is at the Inquisition in the Archivio di Stato in Venice, and the other one is an earlier version which circulated among English and Protestant Christian Hebraists that used the text in order to solve certain questions of legal and religious problems. You see how many times this book is a very short book, very clear, very terse, how many times it was republished: 69, 73, 78, 94, 1714, then 1728, then in the 20th century, in the 30s and in the 70s. And then you see how the translations came. English translation, 3 English translation, a very influential and important translation made by Richard Simon in 74 and 1681, a Dutch translation, a Latin translation, a German translation. There is also a Hebrew translation from the 19th century, and translations appeared also in the work of Picard and Bernard that used Simon. So it's a very successful bestseller of the 17th century, and it appears, and it's very important in order to understand Catholic anti-Jewish polemics, as I will try to show. You see, these are the two versions. The first one published by a Catholic, Taffarel in Paris, and the other one published by himself and checked by himself and changed in Venice. I will skip now the part of what is in this text. And this text is a description of Jewish rituals that usually historians say that was written for Christian audience. I think it was written for Christian audience and also for Jews. And as I will not be able to show here, but I'm quite convinced by that. But the text appears together with another one in the same year. And it's Discorso circa il stato degli ebrei of the other famous rabbi in Venice at that time, Simone Luzzatto. This is not such a successful text like the one of Modena, but it's very influential somehow through different lines. Wolf, the bibliographer at the beginning of the 18th century, writes Liber est rarissimus. So it was very difficult to find it, but we know the Italian Jews were sending material to North Europe for Barnage in order to write his Histoire de Juif. And the information about Luzzatto circulated already also in Amsterdam because he had his pupils, especially Joseph Shlomo del Medico, whose works were printed there. So the reception history is very interesting, and it's interesting because the Discorso is linked to the Converso and Sephardic world, because as you probably know, the text is divided in 18 chapters. The first 10 chapters basically deal exclusively with how to manage a city. So it's a text that actually should be compared with similar texts that are devoted to the city, like, for example, Botero material that was printed at the end of the 16th century. And it's mainly economic issues, the first part of the text. And that's one of the reasons the text was picked up and reused by other Jews in order to support the idea that Jews could be tolerated in Christian society because of their economic usefulness, right? And one interesting thing that I think is in the text is that Luzzatto used the idea of the merchant nation, which was then the type of sort of legal fiction according to which the Sephardic Jews or conversions were circulating in Europe, and transformed it into Natio Hebraica. In this apologetic work, and he's insisting on this, his main objective, like Modena, is to show what Judaism is to an audience, a varied audience in the 17th century. The two texts, I think, should be compared, and I've done it myself a little bit, but already Cohen in 72 and Ravid insisted upon that they should be compared because there are many similar issues that are discussed, and they treat those problems very differently, but problems that were discussed also among other intellectuals at the time. They have a different representation of their own culture and their own religion, and they think that they can communicate that type of culture in a universal form and give to this culture universal meaning. What is the problem for Luzzatto? The problem is, how can we describe the Jews that are a nation without politeia? And for Christian theology, this is a very important issue. When we read, for example, material coming from China, China is a nation of idolaters, but still they have a very complex state institutions, and that is very positive. It has a very positive impact on the way, on how especially the Jesuits interpret that tradition. And the Jews, what are the Jews? The Jews have no politeia. They are in the exile, and I think that Luzzatto tries to give an answer to these problems, but not only using this idea of economic fitness, but he has other theories that have completely been forgotten, but they are there in the text. It's now necessary to read them. And some other theories that can somehow enhance protezione. I put it like toleration, you know, but like we understand what it means. It has a cultural theory and it has also a political theological theory, which is especially contained in chapter 10, where the sources that inspire this chapter might be relating to Bodin and I think also Botero. But, and I will skip this, but this is a very interesting idea that Luzzatto uses the idea of the Christian state performing justice as in a way to claim that it's the goal of the Christian state to give protection to religious minorities, among which also the Jews. But what I want to end, there is also, and in chapter 13, an idea very interesting that also the Bible has created equal citizens. And this is a very important chapter that I think should be reread, because he's using the Bible in a way that we could say in a political interpretation of the Bible. Then for our discussion, we have is chapter 12, which is kind of known because he describes certain types of Baroque anti-Semitism. I call it Baroque anti-Semitism because it's not just anti-Judaism. He has is describing different types of hostility towards Jews. And among the different types, there is a theological, let's say religious zealot type of hostility, which is actually aiming at Spain. There is one political hostility, and then which is what do the cities and what do the states with Jewish minorities. And there is the one that relates to common people, and I will read it very shortly, very briefly. The common people can easily be persuaded by any calumny and slander, however false, invented out of hatred toward the Jewish nation. If these people were capable of any learning or insight, they could be asked to read the ancient sages and historians who dealt with the events surrounding the earliest Christians, such as Tacitus among the Gentiles and Tertullian among the Christians in the Apology. But they would be able to see how many false imputations were made against these innocent people. One could suggest that nowadays the same is happening to the Jews, troubled as they are by men who are hardly friends of the Jewish nation. What is he referring to in this sentence? And what is the slander that preoccupies him, but he doesn't really disclose this, right? He's just saying it's a slander and false calumnies. This slander, type of slander, is the accusation, it's a blood libel accusation. And here we have a very important text which will be used by other ones like Manasseh ben Hizkiah, for example, but also by other intellectuals in the 17th century and also in the 18th centuries, when they would try to counter allegation of ritual murders. Why is it important? It's important because the allegation of ritual murder is also associated with the way rituals, Jewish rituals, are described and are also known in the Christian culture of the 17th century. Here I want to come to these two texts that I have been had a long time ago, and I also publish a very short book, but and I will not say too much about it, but these two texts were published in 1679 and 1681. You all know the famous text of Cardoso, which has one part which is devoted to celebrating the positive features of the Jewish nation and to counter all the slanders and different accusations. And the text, this very short text, which appears to be published in Amsterdam by a certain Isaac Viva, and the interesting thing that when I encountered this text, I was working on Isaac Chaim Cantarini, who was a physician and rabbi from Padua, and this text was often associated to him, and there are many references to the work of Cardoso, although they are quite different, but there are also many similarities. And there are also the same mistakes which appear in the documentary part of the text. And I think that they knew each other, and there is a lot of textual evidence that the author was this Jew from Padua. So I think there was a strong connection between the two of them. And this is, of course, I will not go into the comparison. I will leave it to maybe to the published version of this text. But this is very important because whereas Cardoso speaks to a Sephardic world, the Latin text speaks to a Christian world, but incorporating all those themes that were already circulating and also that were already appearing in Christian material. For example, the Richard Simon text written in 1670 after the case of the blood libel against Raphael Levi, and also Protestant material that circulated around the Lutheran around Lutheran culture, which tried to counter blood libels in the German Empire, in the empire in Central Europe. So this text was very successful in a certain sense. It was repeated, and the arguments were somehow reaching also up to the 20th century. So they are very similar. They have similar attitudes, how to deal with the Bible, how to defend against this allegation, but they also have differences. Why this text was written in Latin, of course, he didn't want to be recognized as a Jew or something like that. It was, of course, published because in that moment, a lot of Catholic texts about Simon of Trent were circulating and were published in order to reinforce the process of the beatification of the Holy Child. And as you see here, this is one of the images, but this is often the hidden target of these defenses that were published by Jews, especially Jews in the north part of Italy and in the Venetian Republic. I wanted to come to this. Why ritual these two texts, and why the relevance of the text of Leone Modena? Here you see two Catholic polemics, actually one extremely successful, this one written by Paolo Sebastiani Medici, who is a Jew converted to Catholicism from Livorno, published many times and very successful. preacher to the Jews in Florence. And Derech Emunah, Via della Fede, mostrata agli ebrei. It's another text published a few years after the ones I showed you, after Cardoso and after Cantarini, by another convert from Venice, Samuel Nachmias, who became Giulio Morosini. And this is a very interesting text because it's always been claimed that this is a very complex and very detailed analysis of Jewish rituals. It's divided in 3 parts. It has all the typical arguments against the Jews, but it's a systematic confutation of Leone Modena. This one and the second one. The text against which they write is against Leone Modena, is against this little text that was still printed and read and circulated. But what is interesting in both authors, and especially in Giulio Morosini, which was not noticed until very recently, is that Giulio Morosini has also a conversion narrative in the text. There is a long description of how he converts to Catholicism, putting all this story in Venice with Simone Luzzatto, with Leone Modena, maybe the Cardoso's brothers were there, according to Yerushalmi. There was a public debate with the 2 brothers. And but what is interesting is that besides being very precise and detailed and so forth, there is again a chapter which claims that the Jews commit ritual murder. And the same we can say about Paolo Medici, who also was a translator, translating texts that were depicting the killing of Christian children, and especially the process of the creation, the sanctification of these children. So at the beginning of the 18th century, we have what I'm trying to understand, and how these Jewish narratives were used and reused, how they were countered and also debated. But also I'm trying to understand the different Catholic attitudes towards the question of Jewish rituals. Because the Jewish rituals, as Modena had imagined, were somehow a way to criticize the Augustine perception that the Jews were not able to interpret their own biblical tradition because they had their interpretation, their hermeneutical interpretation was wrong, right? And this apparently this material, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of tests like this in Italian. It explains the fact that there are many Jewish polemical works against Christianity. I think that's the only way to understand why in North Italy there are so many texts in this period against Christianity. And also it helps to understand different perceptions of Jewish, again, existence as a diaspora group, as in exile. And these Catholic Italian perspectives are, of course, different from French receptions, like, for example, Richard Simon, or like some other reception in North Europe. I'm done.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive view of Jewish apologetics and polemics in some part as well. So I'm calling for questions, remarks. Yes.
It's really exciting work to me, especially to me because I feel it really dovetails with my own recent work. So I'm really excited to talk with you more, particularly about the question of whether there's a political body against.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it will also connect with what I talk about tomorrow. And so in that connection, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about Modina's presentation of what Judaism is
Mhm.
as based on ritual. So
Mhm.
I hear you essentially connecting it with traditions of Italian treatment of ritual, not only of your ritual, but also other religions. How does one come to distill a religion to ritual, and what does it mean to do that, and what is it?
Yeah, well, I think that his idea is idea of describing Judaism in exile through ritual comes, I think, first of all, because he's asked by Christians, but also because he's very interested in ritual and is very interested in changing and fixing ritual for the Jews also of the community of Venice, because his continuous activity in publishing and editing liturgical texts, for example. My idea is that that's very subtle way to tell the Christian, look, you keep saying that the law is finished, the law is after Paul has ended, but this is Jewish life in the diaspora. It's rooted in the Bible, so it's the use of the Bible. They both Modena and Luzzatto use the Bible in political ways, one emphasizing the religious body of that tradition, and the other one using it more like in more subtle ways, right? Because I think Luzzatto is also helpful to understand, for example, certain elements of Spinoza. So I think that, there's a lot of debate whether he's a Maimonidean and he is somehow trying to provide this rational idea of Judaism, but he has a point, because the Catholics are keeping saying that the Jews are irrational. All those polemics that are published after this text are trying to demonstrate exactly the opposite. The Judaism is irrational, is superstitious, is magic. So his idea is to sort of like distill the biblical and post-biblical tradition, religious tradition, and to show the Christian, look, this is what the body of Judaism in the diaspora is. That's my interpretation.
So, yes, your talk remembers me François Hartog book, Ancients, Moderns, and Savages. Because on the one hand, in what Anne was talking about, we can see a kind of discursive shift, perhaps, in which both apologues and polemicists, they use as the sensibility for ethnography, which comes from the discovery of the world and first imperialism. And this has to do not only, of course, with Augustine, but with a new kind of way. How do you hierarchize cultures? Yes, not only regarding the wisdom, but regarding the degree of civilization. And this perhaps is a really a very important shift, which also was integrated into the Jewish context. And on the other hand, it puzzled me a lot, Luzzatto claim on behalf of Clemencia, quoting the case of the early Christians, persecuted Christians, that is they use in indirect and very reflective way of ancient history,
right?
What Carlo Ginzburg and others they developed on this kind of estrangement,
yes,
in order to point, and in these ways, really they're very illuminating.
Yes, this Ostrania.
The estraniazione, the estrangement by using history.
Yes.
Yeah,
I didn't touch upon that, but it's very much there. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
I really wanted to ask something very close to or comment in the vein that Cloud did. But since you've already answered that, I'd like to ask how the two, Giulio Morosini and Paolo Sebastiano Medici, how they dealt with this sort of new presentation of ritual, which seemed to also move from sort of a dogmatically based polemic to something that's quite new.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting how they do it because somehow they have to acknowledge this text. They cannot do without it. So the strategy is to go and describe the same ritual, adding other material, like for example, already Buxtorf. And Modena is, of course, claiming that he's writing also against Buxtorf. So they use other sources, so they can say, no, but he was lying because there are all these magic rituals as well, because it's there's so much superstition. And I think one important element at the beginning of the 18th century is this obsession that the Catholic Church has with Jews, claiming that the Jews are superstitions and they use a lot of magic when the Catholics were doing the same. So they had sources from the rabbinic and Kabbalistic tradition. For example, Modena never mentioned Kabbalah, whereas these texts are full of Kabbalistic sources. That's one way, yeah.
Thank you. Francisco, please.
Very briefly, thank you. Simone Luzzat, when he talks about the emotion without volunteer, he reminded me of Damian Zoyce, the Portuguese chronicler, who of the kingdom of the realm of the number of Portugal. And he mentions the expulsion of the Jews and forced conversion. And he says that the Portuguese king was much harsher on Jews than the Muslims, because really, because the Jewish people did have a state.
The Muslim, yeah. Yeah.
Does he mention the voice?
You know, the point is that his sources, the one that he openly quotes, are very few. But there are many other sources, because you can see because you haven't seen the text, but there's a lot of Machiavelli, there's a lot of Botero, and there is, I think there are also Spanish or Portuguese sources. He talks a lot about also the expulsion of the Muslim, and it talks a lot, not openly, but in this cryptic Baroque way, which is beautiful, it's beautifully written, but you really have to try to understand what he wants to say. He talks a lot about the expulsion of the Jews. And that's why he's trying to provide a theory, or even more than one, for the Jews in the diaspora. And not only the Jews, but really the conversos are there. They are one of his point of reference. So I think there are also sources that come, but not openly mentioned.
Thank you. Nita,
okay, only a comment and a question about what you said about the justification of the ritual murder in polemical work. Francisco de Torrejoncillo, in his book Centinea, his description about the punishment that every tribe of the Jews has received for crucifying Jesus Christ was based on a book published in Rome by a convert. So perhaps this polemic books published in Rome did impact in Spain, because Torrejoncillo mentioned this book that published in Rome especially. And the second question is what struck me is the use of the history of the Christian persecution by the pagans as a reason to defend the Jews from Christian persecution. Can you please comment about the history of this comment and how it was used? Because 200 years later, the pro-toleration polemics will say, as the Christians were persecuted unjustly by the pagans, no, the Christians are not allowed to persecute anyone.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, from what I know so far is that the first one to use this argument is Elia del Medico. And it's a very short part of his text, which is about, it's a text written after the case of Trent. It's a text on philosophy, and it's an anti-Christian text that deals with philosophical and theological questions, but there he says this. And when the text was also edited in the 19th century by the Italian Maschilin, they erased it. But there is this transmission. So then it appears there, then it appears in Richard Simon, and then it appears in this text and in Manasseh ben Israel as well. I don't know, probably there are more. So there is already from the late 15th century an argument about that is probably used. You know, it's necessary to check also other polemical and apologetic works written in Italy before this period, where that kind of argument could be picked up.
Thank you. That's enormously interesting. Thank you for your lecture, for the discussion. And we come to our third and last speaker, Matt Goldish. You want to speak from there, or? All right. So Matt Goldish is Samuel M. and Esther Melton Chair in History at the Ohio State University. He has written about Messianism, about Sephardim, conversos, Jewish-Christian intellectual relations, spirit possession, and the topics. And I think most of us know his books, Judaism and the Theology of Sir David Newton, published in, I think, I don't know how I came to this, Sir Isaac Newton, 1998, his publication on the Sabbatean Prophets, Harvard University Press, 2004, and a collection in English, Jewish Questions, Responsa on Jewish Life in the Early Modern Period, published in 2008. Matt Goldish will speak about Kabbalah and philosophy in Rabbi Jacob Sasportas' teaching to his audience of former conversos.
I was asked to face the camera. I'll just. Sorry. Okay. Thank you for honoring me with the opportunity to be here among distinguished colleagues and my teacher, Professor Kaplan. I apologize for the topic switch because this was originally supposed to be the topic I was speaking on last week at the seminar. We are now moving from Jewish-Christian polemics to intra-Jewish polemics here in this talk. And my
subject, Sasportas is addressing really two types of Jews. He is polemicizing with two types of Jews here, with ordinary ignorant Jews and with rabbis who are also ignorant. Okay. So this short paper is intended to show how Chacham Yaakov Sasportas, 1610 to 1698, formulated his approach to Aristotelian philosophy and Sephirotic Kabbalah in a polemical context. While Jewish law, halacha, was of paramount importance in Sasportas's thought, his views in halacha, philosophy, and Kabbalah work conjointly as elements in a larger strategy for the defense of a maximalist view of rabbinic authority. Sasportas prided himself on being a direct descendant of the great Catalan Kabbalist and exegete Moses ben Nachman, Nachmanides, the Ramban, Bonastruk Saporta, who died around 1270. So one might imagine that this could cause him to distance himself from medieval Jewish Aristotelian rationalism, best represented by Moses Maimonides, the Rambam. But the opposite was the case, in fact. Sasportas showed a particular deference to both the legal and the metaphysical views of Maimonides, who plays a principal role in Sasportas's hierarchy of post-Talmudic legal and doctrinal authorities. In his response to Oel Yaakov, number 29, Sasportas responds to an Ashkenazi, Rabbi Shmuel Yisachar Ber. Now, this is not an uncommon name for reasons that I have not ever figured out. And maybe somebody here knows the answer. Gershom Sholem said that this man is the Ber Perelhefter, who was the first Magid, the Thabitian Magid in the home of Abraham Rovigo. I don't know why he thinks that. I don't know where he knows it from, but that would certainly make this more interesting in all kinds of ways. Anyway, while we have only Sasportas's rejoinder and not Ber's original question, the question apparently concerned Maimonides' attitude toward God's unity and the doctrine of negative attributes. Sasportas felt that Ber had not shown proper respect for Maimonides in the phrasing of his question, and Sasportas rebukes him, and I quote, "Before I answer you anything, I will reprove you out of love," it's always out of love, "for advancing complaints against the mighty shepherd, the leader of the faithful," meaning Maimonides, "in the matter of the 13 principles of Jewish dogma, which he taught us. They," by which he means the complaints of Ber, "were falsely conceived, and if it appears in certain other matters, as if Maimonides tends to stray from the words of our tradition, many have defended him eloquently. See the Rivash of blessed memory, who explains what the accusations against him concerned. They were not in matters of God's unity." Sasportas goes on to reproach Ber further and to explain to him where the error in his question lay. He presents a particular, I should mention that if this is a Ber Perelhefter, he wasn't a lightweight. He was a member of the Beit Din, maybe even the Av Beit Din in Prague. Not that that meant anything to Sasportas, but right. He treats him like a kid. Anyway, Sasportas presents a particularly lucid exposition of the doctrine of negative attributes, which was a cardinal idea in Maimonides' philosophy of divine unity. Sasportas returns to his focus on Maimonides in the eulogy for his young student, Moses de Mercado, who died very young. There, Sasportas makes a lengthy excursus into the relative merits of Aristotelian philosophy and what Sasportas conceived of as Jewish thought in opposition, basing himself almost exclusively on Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. All this is not to say, however, that Sasportas was a Maimonidean rationalist. He comments in his introduction to Rabbi Moses Elbaz's Heichal HaKodesh that there is, which is a Kabbalistic work which he edited and was published in the printing house of Menashe ben Israel, that there is general consent to the limitations of logic. Sasportas's defense of Maimonides in philosophical matters is thus puzzling and becomes more so in light of his commitment to Kabbalah. Now, I want to just say that there were plenty of people who thought that Kabbalah and Maimonides fit together just fine. In fact, there's an entire nation at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula that seems to feel that that is just terrific. But when you get to somebody trying to explain that, right, on a sophisticated rabbinical level, that's a little bit different. So there were, it is true, medieval and early modern Kabbalists who were dedicated Maimonideans, including Abraham Abulafia. Abulafia wrote the first complete commentary to the Guide. But the ability to reconcile these deeply conflicting systems of Jewish metaphysics usually involved one of three strategies or approaches. One is a factious esoteric reading of Maimonides. That's one way you could do it. Another way you could make Kabbalah and Maimonides fit together is some fanciful strategies of reconciliation, sometimes pretty convoluted. And the third is really lovely, is the fabrication of documents. You just make it up. And the famous case is somebody wrote this ludicrous deathbed confession of Maimonides in which he says he was really a Kabbalist. So, you know, you could pull that off, that'll make it work out fine. But if you have to explain it, well, that's a little more complicated. So there is a whole series of people who do try this. There's Ibn Sarza and various other people really starting already from the 13th century, but they have to work hard because these are not ideas that fit together very well. Sasportas, who clearly understood a good deal about both systems and was surely aware of the inherent conflicts between them, attempted none of these approaches of reconciliation. In the continuation of the passage to Samuel Baer quoted above, he simply homogenizes Maimonidean rationalism and Kabbalistic mysticism without any attempt at an explanation. He does so again in a discussion about the unity of God, one of the most divisive theological principles debated between rationalists and mystics, right? The unity of God. So I'm going to quote again here. Because he, referring to Maimonides, spoke in this manner about the unity of God, in this matter, that is the unity of God, the truth and righteousness received from Moses, our teacher. I'm going to repeat that line. Because Maimonides spoke in this matter, referring to the unity of God, the truth and righteousness received from Moses, our teacher, mouth to mouth, it is identical. Maimonides is identical with the tradition of my ancestor, Nachmanides of blessed memory, which is identical to the tradition of Rabbi Abraham ben Daud of blessed memory, which is identical with the tradition of Rabbi Azriel of Gerona, which is identical to the tradition of the author of Otsar HaKavod, Rabbi Todros Halevi Abulafia, which is identical to the tradition of the Cordovero of blessed memory and others besides them who speak in the matter of his attributes in order to remove and negate from him, meaning God, plurality of substance, as you will see also in Sefer Avodat HaKodesh. In other words, they're all the same. If you think that they're different, it's because you don't get it, right? Abraham ben David refers to Rabbad of Poskir, the 12th century Provençal legalist, who was Maimonides' most outspoken critic in legal matters. The entire list, Nachmanides, Rabbad, Azriel, Gerona, Todros, Abulafia, Moshe Cordovero, were all, of course, Kabbalists. The Avodat HaKodesh is a Kabbalistic work by Meir Ibn Gabbai, whose first section deals with the sticky problem of God's unity in the mystical world of Sfirot. In other words, of course, right, if you're a Kabbalist, you're trying to explain how God is one, but there are these 10 Sfirot that are emanations out of God. It's very difficult to explain God's unity. It takes theologians, if I may say this, are truly at their best trying to explain things that are impossible. How 3 is 1, how 10 is 1, that is where they shine. Anyway, okay. In short, these are among the people who one would imagine would most oppose Maimonides' view of the unity of God, and whom Maimonides, had he lived in their time, would surely most repudiate. How are we to understand the paradox of Sasportas's position? And again, I want to say he's not the only person who tries to put these traditions together, but he does it by saying, I don't need to explain anything. It's just, they're all the same. He does not accept the philosophical approach of Maimonides, but he vehemently defends Maimonides. He's well aware that the authorities whom he cites in this list argued intensely with the Aristotelians about the nature of the unity of God, but he claims that their views are all identical with each other and identical with Maimonides. The key is in the opening sentence, quote, because Maimonides spoke in this matter the truth and righteousness received from Moses, our teacher. Sasportas here sets the tone for his entire approach to the turmoil of the Jewish world in his day. The philosophical controversies of the Middle Ages are not appropriate to the limited understanding and faith of his contemporaries. The important thing for the Jews of Sasportas's time, and especially in the Western Sephardi diaspora, where he spends the second half of his life, right? The important thing to know is that despite any appearances to the contrary, there is a continuous, unbroken chain of rabbinic tradition from Moses at Mount Sinai until the present day, perhaps more specifically from Moses at Mount Sinai to him, Sasportas, concerning doctrine as well as law. Every Jew must submit to the authority of contemporary rabbis because the rabbis are the conduit of divine wisdom from time immemorial. If a Jew encounters controversies among the rabbinic sages, and by this I mean any controversy between the rabbinic sages, he should pay them no heed. For only the greatest rabbis, like Sasportas, of course, are capable of understanding the rarefied theological subtleties involved. They all, rationalists and Kabbalists alike, agree on every essential issue. For Sasportas, the chief duty of the Jew is emunat hachamim, faith in the sages. I referred to this last week. Shalom Rosenberg asks, does belief in the sages mean loyalty to the Talmud and the oral law, or does it mean loyalty to the unbroken chain of rabbinic scholars linking all generations from the Talmudic period to our own time? The response of Rav Sasportas, says Rosenberg, was unconditionally in favor of the second possibility. He is a maximalist with reference to rabbinic authority. In addition to his polemical stance, is there any clue? In other words, that is clearly directed at ordinary Jews and honestly at most rabbis whom he feels are also pretty ignorant. So in addition to this polemical stance, is there any clue about how Sasportas reconciled rationalist philosophy and Kabbalah in his own thought? Sasportas apparently adopted a position that has become standard in the Orthodox world since the Middle Ages, which is that Maimonides knew of the Kabbalah and had no problem with it, while the Kabbalists, for their part, had nothing but respect for Maimonides. That's not really an answer about how to reconcile them, but that's the direction that he goes. Maimonides, in fact, never mentioned Sfirot, and he was probably unfamiliar with the Kabbalistic doctrine of Sfirot, which was barely in its inception during his lifetime. In other words, that was a doctrine that developed really in the 13th century. It came out of the Hasidei Ashkenaz through Provence and started to develop there. But it was not a fully developed Kabbalistic doctrine in Maimonides' day. And so I would not imagine that he had ever heard of it in the Kabbalistic sense. It's impossible to imagine that he would have had any sympathy for the concept of Sfirot if he had heard of it. Whether or not Sasportas and other rabbis actually believed this tendentious, harmonious view of Jewish thought, it was a linchpin in the type of orthodoxy of which Sasportas was a pioneer, as Yaakov Tweck has elaborated. Sasportas says to Bear, and I quote, "This is the meaning of the negative attributes. This is also the principal teaching of the Kabbalah." In other words, right? Maimonides and Kabbalah. to show that the Sfirot are themselves the unity and the divinity of God. And from now, guard your mouth from sinning with these matters, because those who lack knowledge in them will come to uproot what is planted. Verily, Maimonides never, God forbid, deprecated the doctrine of the Sfirot in his words, and assigned no folly to the Lord. Well, it is true enough that Maimonides did not disparage the doctrine of the 10 Sfirot. As we mentioned, he probably never heard of it. Note the element of warning in Sasportas's assertion that ignorance of theological truth, of which essentially all Jews in his generation were guilty, would ultimately uproot that which is planted, by which he means the Jewish faith. Ignorance about this, and if you have this idea that Maimonides and the Kabbalists are at odds with each other, you're going to destroy Judaism. Almost all of Sasportas's polemical positions derive from his fear that ignorance and its offspring, innovation, would destroy Judaism. In the Pnei Heichal, which is his introduction to this text of Elbaz that I mentioned, Sasportas puts forward his synthetic creed once again. He speaks of the difficulty he found in locating an instructor to teach him Kabbalah, and he concludes that the days of the Kabbalists are over, but all Jewish thinkers are believers in the doctrine of the Sfirot in some sense. So he thinks that Rambam and that everybody else believes in the Sfirot. And I quote, our belief in it, in Kabbalah, is to be differentiated from belief based on investigation, by which he means rationalist philosophy. But is it not true that the philosophers also do not deny the existence of the Sfirot? They rather take them in a different way, in the manner, and watch what he does here. They take them in a different way, in the matter of Rabbi Yosef Albo, that the 10 Sfirot are intelligences, God forbid. A great many theological philosophers have combined belief in investigation with belief in Kabbalah, according to which we live. So he acknowledges, right, that there is a long tradition of homogenizing these traditions, but the minute that he gets to Albo, he is one of the people who does that in his own way. He goes, oh, God forbid that they should be the intelligences, right? Oh, okay, he accepts Sfirot, but not that way. It's not okay. In modern Kabbalah research, of course, the affinity between Sfirot and the Neoplatonic or Gnostic emanation structures is plain. The analogy to Aristotelian intelligences is more of a stretch, but it's found among some medieval Jewish and Muslim thinkers. Sasportas, of course, is uninterested in considering any such relationship. His offhand condemnation of Yosef Albo, however, one of the great Sephardic theologians of the 15th century, subtly indicates Sasportas's underlying awareness that Kabbalah and rationalist Jewish philosophy are not so seamlessly joined. He also unsurprisingly lashes out at those philosophically minded people who wish to deny the Sfirot altogether. His explanation helps clarify his explanation helps clarify his ability to reconcile rationalism and Kabbalah. Those who reject the Sfirot say that the doctrine of Sfirot is a denial of God's unity, no less than is a belief in a Trinity. That's actually a formulation that comes from Rivash. If such opponents had never known of the Sfirot, says Sasportas, right? If these opponents of Kabbalah had never heard of Sfirot, then their view would be merely erroneous. But having knowledge of the Sfirot and then denying their existence makes such people heretics. Why would you be a heretic for denying the Sfirot? By misunderstanding the true nature of God's unity, the denier of Sfirot will not understand how the infinite God, the Ein Sof, remains in simple unity while having to change aspects, such as the shift from an attitude of judgment to one of loving kindness. This is a problem in understanding the idea of God's unity altogether, right? Because we assign all kinds of actions and ideas and aspects to God, and you're left with a problem. How is God one, and all these different things at the same time? So he's saying that the Sfirot are the key to understanding that. This is usually done sasportas through the agency of the Sfirot. One who denies the Sfirot will thus find it necessary to explain such changes within God in ways which impinge on God's unity, which of course the Sfirot don't do. Herein we see the ultimate limitations of Sasportas's Kabbalist rationalist synthesis and his faith in rabbinic tradition. As long as a medieval rationalist such as Maimonides does not mention the Sfirot, he can be comprehended within the chain of tradition because his silence can be read as assent. Sasportas might also be untroubled by rationalists who reinterpret the Sfirot in a philosophical sense, as long as they are not too explicit about exactly how they're doing it. But Albo presents Sasportas with a conundrum, because he is clearly part of the Jewish canonic chain of tradition, but his philosophical understanding of the Sfirot is overtly at odds with the Kabbalist tradition. The resultant cognitive dissonance threatens to dissolve Sasportas's unified picture of rabbinic tradition, at least in the eyes of the modern reader. But he does not even seem to recognize a problem. For Sasportas, the important thing is to affirm the integrity of rabbinic tradition from Mount Sinai to the present and the authority of the rabbis. If he and like-minded traditionalists must invent a harmonious past that conforms to this picture, disregarding contradictory evidence, they will do that without qualms, even though they may be capable of the most incredibly subtle distinctions and fine calculations and wisdom when they craft arguments in the legal realm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We still have some time for questions.
So only a short question. Do you think or see Sasportas as the father of modern Jewish orthodoxy or ultra-orthodoxy? Because even in my religious high school, the teachers did everything to reconcile the tradition. I even have one teacher, Bible teacher, that 1 hour spoke of us why Rashi knew what the Ramban would say and didn't thought like the Ramban. Yes. So it seems to me that's a sport that is the father of.
Yeah, he's not the first one. You know, when Dweck was working on his book, when he first started working on it, we had a lot of discussions about this this idea of Sasportas as kind of the founder of a school of orthodoxy that comes to its peak probably with the Khatam Sofer and Chadash Asur Min HaTorah and so on. I think he backpedaled it in the book, but it's hard for me to see Sasportas as the kind of founder of that movement, because I think he was looking really backwards all the time. And yet he seems to be a participant, whether or not he was the founder. I'd see a straight line between him and that rabbi, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Some ways to add to the question. When I heard you describing the kind of structure that he gives for the unifying Jewish authority, I mean, it brought to my mind immediately, you know, the kind of classic ecclesiastical maneuvers that the theologians in the church were doing ever since the 13th century, and even more so intensifying in the 15th century in order to explain how come all these very different opinions are eventually fit into the one same stream of thought and are harmonious. And the answer was, of course, the Torah, since they all had some kind of an access to either apostolic tradition or a direct contact with the spiritual with the Holy Spirit. So this was the formal logical Aristotelian explanation as to why they're all saying the same, even it seems they contradict each other, because they all had a reach, they all had a grasp of the truth, given what we know, what they thought they know about the truth of the church, that the church has. So my question is, does Spartus give any indication that it's heavily influenced by kind of ecclesiastical ideas of unifying knowledge? We are the idea that we all share the same authority.
So I will say two things about this. I definitely agree that there is a similarity in the theological strategy. It should be easier for Jews because the authority structure within Judaism is so much looser. And you can always say Shiv'im Panim LaTorah and all kinds of things like that. It should make it so much easier. He makes it harder, but it should be relatively easy, and maybe it is.
Which is kind of what Albo does, and can also explain not only in theological terms, but more, let's say,
metaphysical or
why-
dogmatic
why-
terms.
so
Yes,
why do we have such a big?
it's because Albo is explicit about what he's doing. That he explains, and he explains it in terms which are clearly at odds with the Kabbalistic doctrine of Sfirot. That's where Sasportas runs into trouble. If Albo would just say, like the church theologians, well, they all have a tradition, they all fit together, just take my word for it. Sasportas would go, yeah, take his word for it. But he explains it. That's where it runs into trouble. As far as Sasportas's familiarity with Christian doctrine and Christian traditions, he is living in a community where Menashe ben Israel and Mortera and every single rabbi there basically knows a ton about Christianity, but he's coming from North Africa. In the Sabbatean controversies, you discover that he knows enough to recognize that Avram Miguel Cardoso is blatantly bringing Christian theology into Sabbateanism. He can recognize that and make fun of him for it, but that's not very sophisticated, and that's about as much as he seems to know. He is not interested in anything like that. So he seems to do it all on his own. Yeah, but the parallel is very strong.
I guess you can pick up from the general environment. You don't have to be a Christian theologian to get this general idea, but yeah.
Right, there are also secondary paths by which they might.
I'd like to ask the question myself. David Ruderman has insistently made the point that 16th century Italian Jewish thinkers did not admit any contradiction between philosophy and Kabbalah, and there seems to be a tradition that is continued by Amsterdam Jewish thinkers as well, Abraham Cohen Herrera and Menashe ben Israel, who interchangeably wrote philosophical and Kabbalistic sources. And it seems to me that Sasportas stands in a sort of intellectual tradition. And I would like to ask you whether this is perhaps mediated by the practice of preaching, because preachers do this.
Yeah. So preachers are addressing a general audience. I don't know whether Sasportas was ever a preacher in the Western Sephardi diaspora. But as far as it being it's definitely a tradition, but it's a tradition that goes back much further. And there are some rather sophisticated practitioners of this melded concept. But I wouldn't see Herrera as being a good parallel, because Herrera had his own very specific approach, which was a Neoplatonic approach, and can be reconciled beautifully with Kabbalah without much of a problem, as opposed to somebody like Albo. And Menashe ben Israel is, I think we've had this discussion. he's a certain type of late Renaissance collector, right? What he is interested in doing is piling up authorities. The way, for example, Nishmat Chaim, which is my favorite work there, right? Of making any point is by just piling up, right? Here's this authority, and here's what he's not a philosopher in the sense that he's trying to reconcile things. He's just telling you, you know, oh, here's more authority, as if he's going to bury your point under a pile of authority. So I don't know that either of those contemporaries of his in Amsterdam are really doing the same thing he is. But you're right that there are certainly earlier figures who are, right, many people, right, who are trying to make this right, everything fits together, everything, but he does it in a sort of a blunt, ham-fisted manner, where he doesn't try to explain himself. And it has to do with Sasportas's polemic strategy all the way through, which is, you are not smart enough to understand this. You don't have, right, speaking to everybody, including his fellow rabbis, right? You don't have the background to understand this. You don't have the sophistication to understand. I understand this. I'll explain it to you. They all fit together. Just take my word, right? So that's where it's very similar to this kind of a Catholic strategy from the 13th century forward.
You mean Manasseh is much more subtle even in this accumulation?
It's not that he's subtle. He just piles it on. I don't think that Menashe has a sort of philosophical approach to how pieces fit together. Look at the way he writes. He just, you know, here's more. Here's what this church father says. Here's what this rabbi says. Here's what he just piles it on.
The same very voluntaristic conciliation.
A reconciliation requires a philosophical facing down of the problem. You have to recognize that there's a problem, and then you have to show how you can reconcile it. You're right that Menashe doesn't do it, and Sasportas doesn't do it, but I think that Menashe doesn't do it because that's not the way he functions. If you, and here's why I made this comment at the very end, but this is what I mean. When you look at Sasportas as a halachist, he is so sophisticated. He is so subtle. He knows so much. He's able to pull pieces from all over the tradition and make it work. It's not that he can't do that, or that he doesn't have the mind for a sophisticated rapprochement of these approaches. It's just, he doesn't even want to bother. Like he's whoever it is that he's talking to, which again I would say is ordinary members of the congregation and rabbis, especially Western Sephardi rabbis. It's almost as if he feels there's no purpose in trying to explain this to these people because they're not going to understand it anyway. So I try to look at the things he writes and see if I could get at what he himself was thinking. But I feel like maybe that Catholic approach really is kind of where Sasportas is. He's aware that there's a problem, and that little offhand comment that he says about Albo shows that he is aware that there's a problem, but he just glides over it. So I'm not sure what he did for himself.
Well, that's a skeptical way of summing up the question. I think that's a good moment to finish this.